The moon hung cold and sharp over the Wyoming hills. From his position on the ridge, Garrett Sullivan could see the entire Confederate camp below. 17 men, all dressed in gray uniforms that had no business being worn a year after Appomattox. The war was over on paper, but not in these hidden corners of the frontier. Garrett adjusted his rifle scope, his breath forming small clouds in the April chill. His finger rested lightly on the trigger as he tracked the movements of a tall man with captain's bars who gestured emphatically to the others. The man's face was partially obscured by a thick beard, but there was no mistaking the distinctive scar that ran from his left eye to his jawline. "Found you," Garrett whispered. He had tracked this group for 3 weeks across 2 territories. Men who refused to surrender, who continued to raid small settlements and murder in the name of a fallen cause. Men led by Ezra Vance, the Confederate officer who had tortured Garrett's unit after capturing them near Shiloh. Garrett steadied his breathing, preparing for the shot that would end Vance's reign of terror. A shot that would finally bring peace to the ghosts of his fallen comrades who haunted his dreams. The crack of a rifle shattered the silence. Garrett jerked upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sweat soaked his nightshirt, despite the autumn chill that permeated the cabin. He reached instinctively for the rifle that always stood beside his bed, his eyes darting to the window where moonlight spilled across the worn plank floor. There was no Confederate camp, no Ezra Vance, just the lonely expanse of his Wyoming ranch under the October moon of 1878. The nightmare again. 12 years since the war's end, and still it hunted him in the dark. Garrett swung his legs over the edge of the bed, rubbing a hand across his face. At 48, the lines around his eyes had deepened, and gray streaked his once dark hair. He moved to the window, scanning the terrain out of habit. The barn stood silent in the distance. Beyond it, rolling hills disappeared into darkness. Something caught his eye, a dark smear on the porch boards outside his front door. Garrett tensed, reaching for his revolver. Minutes later, lantern in one hand and pistol in the other, he crouched by the front steps. Blood. Not much, but fresh enough to still be tacky to the touch. He followed the trail with his lantern, revealing crimson droplets that led toward the west pasture. At the edge of the lantern's glow, a pair of yellow eyes reflected the light. A wolf, its gray coat matted with blood along one flank, watched him warily before limping away into the darkness. "You're a long way from the mountains," Garrett murmured. The wolf had likely been driven down by early snow in the high country, desperate enough to approach a human dwelling. Wounded probably by another predator or a trap set by one of the newer settlers who didn't understand the delicate balance of the territory. Garrett watched until the animal disappeared. There was a time when he might have tracked it, put it out of its misery. Tonight, something in its defiant gaze and determination to survive, despite its wounds, struck a chord. "Good luck, old soldier," he said to the darkness. "World's not kind to wounded things." He returned to the cabin, but knew sleep would not come again. The dreams were always worse this time of year, when the golden aspen leaves reminded him of Eleanor's hair, and the first frost brought memories of the morning he'd found her cold in their bed. Emily's small body curled beside her mother, both taken by the fever that had swept through the territory in 73. 5 years gone. The pain had dulled from a searing burn to a persistent ache, like an old bullet wound that flared in cold weather. Garrett stoked the fire and settled into the chair beside it. Dawn was still hours away, but his day had already begun another in the endless procession of days that marked his solitary existence on this unforgiving land. First light painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Garrett had been up for hours, splitting wood with mechanical precision. Each swing of the axe drove away the lingering tendrils of last night's nightmare. The rhythmic thunk of steel biting into timber echoed across the quiet homestead. When the sun finally crested the horizon, Garrett had already stacked enough wood to last a week. His breath clouded in the morning chill as he rested the axe against the chopping block and rolled his shoulders, feeling the familiar protest of muscles that reminded him he wasn't a young man anymore. The ranch was modest by Wyoming standards, a sturdy cabin, a barn that housed 4 horses and a milk cow, a chicken coop, and 200 acres of land that stretched from the creek to the foothills. Not grand, but it was his, paid for with the blood and sweat of post-war years, when he'd driven cattle north from Texas, saved every dollar, and finally claimed this piece of earth as his own. Back inside, Garrett washed at the basin by the stove, the cold water shocking against his skin. He dressed methodically, worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, suspenders, and boots that had molded to his feet over countless miles. Before preparing breakfast, he performed the ritual that started every day. From the top drawer of the dresser, he removed a small wooden box, its edges smoothed by years of handling. He placed it on the table and opened it carefully. Inside lay a silver pocket watch, its surface gleaming despite its age. Garrett removed it with reverence, handling it as gently as he might a bird's egg. He polished the casing with a soft cloth, turning it slowly to catch every angle in the morning light. The watch had been a gift from Eleanor, and Emily presented to him on his 43rd birthday, just months before the fever took them. It was engraved with his initials on the outside, but Garrett had never opened it. Not once in 5 years. The day they'd buried Eleanor and Emily, he'd made a vow. The watch would remain closed until he found a reason to move forward again, a purpose beyond mere existence. Until then, it would remain as it was, a testament to time suspended in grief. After returning the watch to its box, Garrett removed a worn Bible from the shelf. Eleanor's Bible. He'd never been a particularly religious man, but she had found comfort in its pages. Since her death, he'd taken to marking passages that spoke of redemption and forgiveness, not out of any genuine faith, but as a way to maintain some connection to her. Though he couldn't read the words, a secret he'd kept from all but Eleanor, he knew many verses by heart from her reading them aloud. His finger traced over a page where she'd underlined Psalm 35, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." Joy had not yet found its way back to Garrett Sullivan, but each morning he rose and continued on, driven by stubborn endurance, if not hope. The day unfolded like countless others before it. He fed the animals, checked fences along the north pasture, and repaired a loose board on the barn door. The repetitive work kept his hands busy and his mind relatively quiet. The ranch demanded attention, and giving it was easier than confronting the emptiness that awaited in stillness. As dusk approached, Garrett noticed storm clouds gathering over the western mountains. The air had turned heavy with the promise of rain, and a cold wind picked up, rattling the shutters of the cabin. He hurried to secure the livestock, moving the horses into the barn and ensuring the chicken coop was properly latched. The first fat raindrops began to fall as he crossed the yard toward the cabin. By the time he reached the porch, the sky had opened completely, releasing a deluge that drummed against the roof and transformed the dirt yard into mud within minutes. Inside, Garrett lit the lamps and stoked the fire. The storm intensified, wind howling around the corners of the cabin like a living thing seeking entry. He prepared a simple supper of beans and salt pork, eating mechanically while listening to the tempest rage outside. A particularly violent gust rattled the windows, and Garrett's thoughts turned to the wounded wolf. Out there, somewhere in this fury, likely seeking shelter, fighting to survive despite its injuries. He understood that drive all too well. When the meal was finished, he cleaned his plate and settled into the chair by the fire with Eleanor's Bible opening to a random page and running his fingers over the words he couldn't decipher, but knew contained both comfort and challenge. Outside, the storm continued its assault, and inside, a solitary man waged his own quiet battle against the darkness. Near midnight, a tremendous crash jerked Garrett from his light doze by the fire. He was on his feet instantly, revolver in hand, before his conscious mind fully registered the sound. Years of survival instincts never quite faded. He listened intently over the howl of the wind. There it was again, a splintering noise from the direction of the barn. One of the doors must have broken free of its latch. "Damn it," he muttered, holstering his revolver and reaching for his oilskin coat. The storm had intensified. Rain lashed sideways, driven by gusts that nearly knocked him off his feet as he stepped from the porch. Lantern held high, he fought his way across the yard mud, sucking at his boots with each step. The barn door hung precariously from one hinge, swinging violently in the wind. Behind it, the horses whinnied nervously, stamping their hooves on the straw-covered floor. Garrett wrestled the door back into position, securing it with rope, when the latch proved bent beyond immediate repair. The animals calmed once the door was fixed, but as Garrett turned to leave, a sound cut through the storm's fury, faint but unmistakable. A human voice. "Please, open it. I can't breathe." Garrett froze, lantern extended. The voice had come from the old storage shed adjacent to the barn, a place he rarely entered these days. It leaned slightly, its weathered boards gray with age, roof sagging under the weight of the years. "Please." The voice was weaker this time, muffled by both the structure and the storm. Instinct and experience warred within him. In these remote parts, strangers often meant danger. The war had left the country with too many desperate men, and the frontier attracted those seeking to escape their past or the law. Garrett drew his revolver, approached the shed cautiously. Water ran in rivulets down his face as he reached for the door with his free hand, easing it open just enough to shine the lantern inside. The beam cut through dust and shadow, revealing a dirt floor, scattered with forgotten tools and empty grain sacks. And there, in the corner, something moved. A large burlap sack, tied with rope at the top, writhed slightly against the wall. "Help me," came the voice from within, barely audible now. Garrett stepped inside, placing the lantern on an overturned barrel. His revolver remained trained on the sack as he approached. Close up, he could see the burlap was stained with dark patches that could only be blood. He knelt, keeping the gun ready, and used his free hand to work at the knots. They were tied tightly with deliberate complexity, not the work of someone who expected the bindings to be undone. As the rope finally gave way, Garrett pulled the sack open. The smell hit him first. Blood, sweat, and fear, a combination he knew too well from the war. Then his lantern illuminated the contents, and his breath caught. A woman lay curled inside her face, bruised, lips cracked and bleeding. A filthy gag had been tied across her mouth, and her wrists bore raw marks from bindings. Her clothes, once a simple traveling dress, were torn and stained. Dark hair, matted with blood and dirt, framed a face that, despite the injuries, couldn't be much older than 25. Garrett holstered his weapon and gently removed the gag. The woman gasped, drawing in ragged breaths, as if each one might be her last. Her eyes fluttered open, a startling blue, even in the dim light, and locked onto his with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. "Don't let them find me," she whispered. "Who?" Garrett asked, already scanning the shed for other threats. But the woman's eyes rolled back, and she slipped into unconsciousness before she could answer. Garrett didn't hesitate. He gathered her into his arms, surprised at how little she weighed, and carried her through the storm toward the cabin. Her head lolled against his shoulder, raindrops mixing with the blood on her face. Inside, he laid her gently on the bed, Eleanor's side untouched for 5 years, and worked quickly to assess her injuries. A gash along her hairline had bled freely but was beginning to clot. Bruises in various stages of healing mottled her arms and face, telling a story of prolonged abuse. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Garrett heated water on the stove and gathered clean rags. He had rudimentary medical knowledge from his time as a scout, enough to clean wounds and recognize when injuries were beyond his skill. As he gently cleaned the blood from her face, she remained unconscious, which was perhaps a mercy given the pain she would feel upon waking. The storm raged on outside, but within the cabin, an unexpected vigil had begun. Garrett Sullivan, who had spent 5 years avoiding the company of others, now found himself guardian to a stranger who carried troubles of her own troubles that had followed her to his door on a night when even the heavens seemed at war with the earth. Dawn arrived with tentative fingers of light pushing through the cloud-heavy sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by water puddles reflecting the clearing sky, droplets clinging to every surface, the air washed clean of dust and carrying the scent of damp earth. Garrett hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in the chair beside the bed, watching the woman's labored breathing, changing the cool cloth on her forehead, when fever threatened and wondering who had done this to her and why they had left her at his ranch of all places. As morning light filtered through the window, she stirred a small moan escaping her lips. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened fully revealing that startling blue once more. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Then memory returned, and with it, fear. She jerked upright, only to fall back with a gasp of pain. "Easy," Garrett said, his voice rough from the long night. "You're safe here." She stared at him, eyes wide and wary. "Who are you?" "Garrett Sullivan. This is my ranch." He kept his distance, knowing his size and weathered appearance could be intimidating. "Found you in my storage shed last night during the storm." She tried to sit up again more slowly this time. Garrett helped her, propping pillows behind her back. She winced, but managed to stay upright. "Water," he offered, and when she nodded, he poured a cup from the pitcher beside the bed. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin in her haste. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and said, Rebecca Harlow." "Miss Harlow." Garrett nodded. "Mind telling me how you ended up in a sack in my shed?" She looked down at her hands now resting in her lap. They were small, but work-hardened with broken nails and scrapes across the knuckles. Not the hands of someone who'd led an easy life. "I was with a wagon train," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Heading to Oregon. We were 2 days out from Fort Laramie when they came. Men, 5 of them, wore bandanas over their faces, but their leader," she shuddered. "He had a symbol on his coat, a snake curled into a V shape. I heard one of the others call them the Viper Gang." Garrett's expression remained neutral, but something cold settled in his stomach. He'd heard whispers of the Viper Gang outlaws who preyed on settlers and wagon trains known for their brutality. "They attacked at night," Rebecca continued, "killed the men who tried to fight, took valuables, and they took me." Her voice faltered. "Said I'd fetch a good price at a place called the Red Door in Fort Rock." "A brothel," Garrett said grimly. Rebecca nodded, her face flushing with shame and anger. "I fought. That's why." She gestured vaguely to her injuries. "Yesterday, they were bringing me to Fort Rock when they thought someone was following them. They argued then the leader, a man with a scar here, she traced a line from her eye to jaw, hit me and stuffed me in that sack. Said they'd come back once they'd dealt with whoever was tracking them. The description of the scar sent a jolt through Garrett, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. And they left you in my shed. I don't know where they left me. I was barely conscious by then. She met his gaze directly. I'm not lying, Mr. Sullivan. Didn't say you were. Garrett stood and moved to the stove, giving her the space to compose herself. Hungry. She nodded, and he set about preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush with the last of the summer's preserved berries. As he worked, he processed her story, looking for inconsistencies or signs of deception. Years as a scout had taught him to read people, and while her fear and trauma seemed genuine, something felt off. He brought her a bowl, and she ate like someone accustomed to hunger, careful not to waste a single bite. When she finished, he took the bowl and said, "Let me check your wounds." She tensed but nodded, allowing him to examine the gash on her head. As he worked, his fingers brushed her hair aside, revealing a small scar near her collarbone. Not a fresh injury, but an old mark, a small 5-pointed star, the skin puckered and white with age. Garrett's hands stilled. He knew that mark, had seen it on Confederate spies during the war, members of a particular unit that operated behind Union lines. Ezra Vance's unit. His demeanor changed instantly, almost imperceptibly, a slight stiffening of his shoulders, a cooling in his eyes. But Rebecca noticed. She pulled away from his touch, drawing the blanket higher. "What is it?" she asked. Garrett stepped back, his face now a carefully composed mask. "That mark, by your shoulder." Her hand flew to the scar, covering it protectively. "It's nothing. Doesn't look like nothing." His voice had hardened. "Looks like the mark of Vance's Rangers, Confederate intelligence unit during the war." Rebecca's eyes widened, then narrowed. "It's not what you think." "What should I think, Miss Harlow?" He moved to the fireplace, positioning himself between her and the door. "That it's coincidence a woman with a ranger's mark ends up on my property. That the man who took you happens to match the description of Ezra Vance." "I was a child during the war," she said, an edge entering her voice. "This scar, I got it when I was 7, from a heated iron rod at the orphanage when I spilled washing water on the headmistress's shoes. She pressed it to my skin to teach me carefulness." Her hand remained over the mark, as if she could erase it through sheer will. "I don't know anything about Rangers or whatever you're talking about." Garrett studied her, weighing her words against his suspicions. The war had left deep wounds across the country, and old hatreds died hard. If Vance was truly alive and operating in this territory, if this woman was somehow connected to him. "Mr. Sullivan," Rebecca said softly, breaking into his thoughts, "I understand your caution, but I'm not your enemy. I'm just trying to survive." Something in her tone, the raw honesty of it, gave him pause. He'd been alone too long, perhaps, seeing threats where there might be none. "Rest," he finally said, his voice neutral. "We'll talk more when you're stronger." He gathered her empty bowl and moved to the door. "I need to check the animals. Stay inside." As he closed the door behind him, Garrett heard her call softly, "Thank you for saving my life." He didn't respond. Outside, he took a deep breath of the rain-washed air, trying to clear his head. If Vance was indeed in the territory, if he was behind the Viper gang, then trouble had found Garrett Sullivan, despite his best efforts to retreat from the world. That night, Garrett slept in the chair by the fire, his revolver within easy reach. Down the short hallway in Eleanor's bed, Rebecca Harlow slept fitfully, occasionally crying out from nightmares that seemed all too real. Two wounded souls under one roof, each carrying secrets and scars, while outside the vast Wyoming wilderness kept its own counsel under the watchful eyes of the stars. Morning revealed fresh tracks in the mud around the barn horseshoes that didn't match Garrett's animal's boot prints, too large to be his own. Someone had been on his property during the night, moving with enough stealth to avoid waking him despite his light sleep. Garrett followed the tracks to the paddock, where he found one of his horses sporting a fresh cut along its flank. Not deep enough to seriously injure the animal, but deliberate a message. Inside the cabin, Rebecca sat at the table wrapped in a quilt. The night's rest, despite the nightmares, had brought some color back to her face. She looked up as he entered, immediately sensing his tension. "They were here," she said. It wasn't a question. Garrett nodded once, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Checked the property, but didn't approach the cabin. Cut one of my horses." He fixed her with a steady gaze. "They'll be back." Fear flickered across Rebecca's face, but she straightened her shoulders. "I should leave. I've brought danger to your home." "And go where?" Garrett asked. "In your condition, you wouldn't make it 5 miles before they found you." He moved to the hearth, lifted the worn rug that lay before it, and revealed a trap door set into the floorboards. Rebecca watched wide-eyed as he lifted it, exposing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Storm cellar?" she asked. "Safe room," Garrett corrected. "Built during the war when raiders, both Union and Confederate, were a constant threat out here." He lit a lantern and handed it to her. "Go on down. I'll bring supplies." Rebecca hesitated only briefly before taking the lantern and carefully descending the stairs. Garrett followed with blankets, food, water, and a small revolver. The space below was surprisingly well-constructed walls of stacked stone, a packed dirt floor covered partially with wooden planks, and a ceiling reinforced with timber. A narrow cot stood against one wall, a small table and chair against another. Shelves held preserves, candles, and other essentials. In the far corner, barely visible in the lantern light, a small tunnel entrance provided an escape route that emerged behind a rock outcropping 50 yards from the house. "My father built this place," Garrett explained, setting the supplies on the table. "Said a man should always have somewhere to retreat to when the world comes calling with bad intentions." Rebecca ran her hand along the cool stone wall. "It's reassuring, in a sobering way." Garrett checked the revolver before placing it on the table. It was an old Navy Colt, well-maintained despite its age. "You know how to use this?" Rebecca picked up the weapon with a familiarity that confirmed his suspicions. She checked the cylinder, tested the action, then set it down again. "Yes." He raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment on her obvious experience with firearms. Instead, he placed Eleanor's Bible beside the gun. "In case you get bored down here." Rebecca's fingers brushed the worn leather cover, a small smile touching her lips. "Thank you." As she opened the Bible, her expression changed, becoming thoughtful. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," she recited, "for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." Something flickered in Garrett's eyes, surprise perhaps at her immediate recognition of the passage. "You know, the good book." "It was the only reading material at the orphanage," she replied. "The headmistress insisted we memorize a verse each day. Said it would build character." A shadow crossed her face. Some lessons were enforced more harshly than others. Garrett nodded, understanding more than she might realize about harsh lessons and enforced discipline. "Stay down here today. I need to check the property, see what else our visitors might have left behind." "Mr. Sullivan," Rebecca called as he turned to leave. "If they come back, what then?" Garrett paused at the foot of the stairs, his face half in shadow. "Then we'll find out if my father was right about retreat being the better part of valor." He climbed the stairs, closing the trapdoor behind him and replacing the rug. Outside, the day had turned bright and cool, the storm's passage leaving a false sense of tranquility across the landscape. Garrett knew better. The calm after the storm often presaged greater danger to come. With his rifle slung across his back, he walked the perimeter of his property, alert for any sign of the intruders from the night before. Near the western fence line, he found what he was looking for, a crude symbol carved into a fence post, a snake curled into the shape of a V. The Viper Gang had marked his property, claimed it as their territory, or perhaps marked it for retribution. Farther along, a more disturbing discovery awaited. The old herding dog that occasionally visited the ranch lay dead beside the creek, a single bullet hole between its eyes. Attached to its collar was a scrap of paper, the message written in a firm, educated hand, "Return her." Garrett's jaw tightened. The casual cruelty of killing the dog spoke volumes about the men he was dealing with. Men who saw life, animal or human, as disposable. Men like Ezra Vance. The name brought back a flood of memories. Vance, the Confederate officer, whose methods had earned him a reputation for brutality, even among his own side. Vance, who had executed 3 of Garrett's fellow scouts after capturing them near Shiloh. Vance, who should have been dead these 12 years past. The official report stated that Ezra Vance had died in a fire at a Richmond boarding house in 1866, shortly after being pardoned by President Johnson, despite evidence of war crimes. Garrett had never believed it, had spent 2 years searching for him before finally accepting that the trail had gone cold. Now it seemed the ghosts of the past had found him instead. Back at the cabin, Garrett checked every window and door, reinforcing latches where needed. From a trunk beneath his bed, he retrieved items he'd hoped never to need again: a Sharps rifle with a long-range scope, a box of ammunition, and a leather belt, holding 2 additional revolvers. The day passed with a tense quiet, broken only by the occasional bird call or distant lowing of cattle. By late afternoon, Garrett returned to the trapdoor, lifting it to find Rebecca sitting on the cot, Eleanor's Bible open in her lap. "Find anything?" she asked, looking up. Garrett descended the stairs, his expression grim. "They left their mark. And a message." He didn't mention the dog, seeing no need to add to her burden. "They want you back." Rebecca closed the Bible, her knuckles white against its worn cover. "I told you I should leave." "That's not an option," Garrett said firmly. "They've already searched the property once. They'll be watching the roads, the trails. Then what do we do?" Garrett considered the question, weighing their limited options. "We wait, prepare, and when they come again, and they will, we make them regret it." Rebecca studied him, her gaze penetrating. "You know them, don't you? Or at least you know their leader." "I knew a man who matches your description. During the war." Garrett's voice was carefully neutral. "Ezra Vance, Confederate intelligence officer, known for his creative approach to interrogation." "The man with the scar," Rebecca said softly. "He never used a name around me, just gave orders." Garrett sat on the single chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Tell me everything you remember about him. Every detail." As Rebecca spoke, describing the man's mannerisms, his way of speaking, the respect and fear he commanded from his men, Garrett's certainty grew. Ezra Vance had survived, and whatever game he was playing now included Rebecca Harlow, and by extension, Garrett himself. The question that remained was, why? Why take Rebecca? Why leave her at Garrett's ranch specifically? Was it coincidence, or was Vance aware of Garrett's presence in the territory? Too many questions, too few answers. But one thing was clear: the past had returned, bringing with it the promise of violence that Garrett had spent years trying to escape. That night, as Rebecca slept in the safe room below, Garrett sat by the cabin window, rifle across his knees, watching the darkness for shadows that moved with purpose. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath their cold light, while a solitary man kept vigil against enemies both seen and unseen. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the first true hint of winter on the wind. Frost rimmed the edges of the water trough, and the horse's breath formed small clouds in the early light. Garrett, who had dozed only briefly during the night, began his day with heightened vigilance. After checking that Rebecca was still safely hidden in the cellar, he made a more thorough inspection of his property. The evidence of intrusion had multiplied overnight. Someone had been to the main gate, the crude snake symbol now carved more prominently into the gatepost, a deliberate announcement of presence and intent. But it was what Garrett found near the old oak tree that sent ice through his veins. His dog, a loyal black and tan hound that had been with him since before Eleanor's death, lay dead beneath the spreading branches, its throat cut. Pinned to the animal's collar was a folded piece of paper higher quality than the previous note. Garrett removed it with steady hands that belied the rage building inside him. The message was simple, written in the same educated hand: return her. Killing a stray was one thing. Killing a man's dog, an animal that had been part of Garrett's dwindling family, was a declaration of war. He buried the dog beneath the oak, digging the grave with controlled fury, each thrust of the shovel driven by memories of the animal's unwavering loyalty. When the task was complete, he stood for a long moment, hat in hand, allowing himself this one moment of grief before returning to the vigilance that their situation demanded. Back at the cabin, he descended to the safe room to find Rebecca awake and alert the revolver within easy reach on the table. "You've been gone a while," she said, searching his face. Garrett didn't soften the truth. "They killed my dog. Left another message." Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, pain crossing her features. "I'm sorry. This is my fault." "No," Garrett said firmly. "It's Vance's fault. Men like him understand only one language: violence. They deal in fear." Rebecca opened Eleanor's Bible, her fingers tracing the faded ink of underlined passages. "Your wife's?" she asked softly. Garrett nodded once, not trusting himself to speak about Eleanor. "She marked beautiful passages," Rebecca continued, "about mercy, redemption." She looked up at him. "Faith." "Eleanor believed," Garrett said simply. "I lost whatever faith I had at Shiloh." Rebecca didn't press, seeming to understand the weight of unspoken history behind his words. Instead, she changed the subject. "Tell me about Vance. What he was during the war." Garrett settled onto the chair, the memories he'd spent years burying now rising to the surface. Ezra Vance, major in the Confederate Army, though he rarely wore a uniform, led a unit called Vance's Rangers, Special Intelligence Operatives, who worked behind Union lines. He paused, the images too vivid even after all these years. They were effective, brutal. Vance himself had a reputation for getting information from prisoners by any means necessary. Rebecca listened intently, her expression grave. "And you encountered him." "My unit was captured near Shiloh. 8 of us scouts for the Union Army." Garrett's voice had gone flat, emotionless. "Vance personally interrogated each man. 3 died during questioning. 2 more were executed afterward." "And you?" Rebecca asked quietly. "I escaped, with 2 others." Garrett's hand unconsciously moved to his side, where a long scar marked the path of a Confederate bullet. Only one of us made it back to Union lines. Rebecca absorbed this, connecting the pieces. And now he's here, leading the Viper gang. So it seems. Garrett stood unable to remain still with the past pressing so close. The official record says he died in Richmond in '66. A fire. I never believed it. Why would he target you now, after all this time? I don't know. Garrett turned to face her. But I intend to find out. As the day progressed, Garrett divided his time between strengthening the cabin's defenses and keeping watch. Rebecca remained below, though he could hear her moving around occasionally, the sounds of pages turning or quiet footsteps on the packed earth floor. Around midday, he brought her a simple meal of jerky biscuits and coffee. As he handed her the plate, he noticed she'd arranged the small space with surprising efficiency. Blankets neatly folded, supplies organized on the shelves, the Bible open on the table with a small stone holding the page. "You've made yourself at home," he observed. Rebecca smiled faintly. "Old habit. The orphanage taught us to be orderly, no matter the circumstances." She took a sip of coffee, then asked, "Do you have family, Mr. Sullivan, besides—" She gestured vaguely upward, indicating Eleanor. "No." The word came out more sharply than he'd intended. After a moment, he added, "My parents died before the war. No siblings. Eleanor was an only child. Our daughter Emily was 5 when the fever took them both." Rebecca's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry." Garrett nodded once in acknowledgement, uncomfortable with her compassion. He turned to leave, but paused when she spoke again. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice hesitant. "May I ask, that Bible, you keep it, treasure it, but what?" Rebecca met his gaze directly. "You hold it upside down when you look at it." The observation hung in the air between them. Garrett's expression hardened, a lifetime of practiced deflection, rising to his defense. "And you can't read, can you?" The question, asked without judgment or pity, still stung like salt in an open wound. It was his most carefully guarded secret, one that Eleanor had helped him hide for years. "Never learned," he finally admitted, the words feeling like rocks in his mouth. "Not properly. Can sign my name. Recognize a few words. Numbers." He shrugged, feigning indifference. "Scout doesn't need letters to read sign." Rebecca nodded, accepting his explanation without the surprise or condescension he'd come to expect from educated people. "Would you like to learn—" The offer caught him off guard. "What, to read," she clarified. "I could teach you. I taught the younger children at the orphanage." Garrett stared at her, uncertain how to respond. The idea had a certain appeal, to finally unlock the mystery of the written word, to read Eleanor's Bible himself, rather than relying on memory of her voice. But it also meant admitting a vulnerability, allowing someone into a space he'd kept fiercely private. "Why would you do that?" he asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Rebecca's answer was simple. "Because you saved my life, and because everyone deserves to read the words that bring them comfort." Before Garrett could respond, a sound from above captured his attention, the distant but unmistakable approach of horses. He moved quickly to the stairs. "Stay here," he ordered. "No matter what you hear." He closed the trapdoor, replaced the rug, and moved to the window, rifle in hand. Through the glass, he could make out 3 riders approaching from the east, still distant, but moving with purpose toward his ranch. Garrett checked his weapons, his mind shifting to the familiar clarity of impending conflict. Whether they came for Rebecca or for him, whether this was Vance's doing or simply bad luck, the moment of confrontation had arrived. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first few snowflakes of the season, harbingers of the harsh Wyoming winter to come. Inside, a man prepared to defend his home against the ghosts of a war that for some had never truly ended. The riders passed the ranch without stopping. They were not Vance's men at all, but a U.S. Marshal and two deputies tracking a cattle rustler who'd been operating in the territory. Garrett had recognized the marshal's badge from a distance and met them at the gate, his rifle lowered but ready. Their brief conversation, terse on Garrett's part, yielded no useful information beyond the confirmation that law enforcement was spread thin across the territory. The marshal promised to keep an eye out for the Viper gang, but made it clear that his current priorities lay elsewhere. As the lawmen disappeared over the eastern ridge, Garrett returned to the cabin, his relief at the false alarm tempered by the knowledge that real danger still lurked. The falling snow had intensified, leaving a dusting of white across the landscape, the first significant snowfall of the season weeks earlier than usual. Inside, he lifted the trapdoor to find Rebecca sitting calmly at the table, the revolver laid out before her. "All clear," he said. "For now." She nodded, the tension visibly leaving her shoulders. "I heard voices. Marshal and deputies passing through." Garrett descended the stairs. "Snow's starting. Early this year." Rebecca glanced toward the ceiling as if she could see through it to the sky beyond. "Bad timing?" "Winter in Wyoming is never good timing," Garrett replied dryly. "But it might work in our favor. Snow makes tracking easier. We'll see them coming." He settled onto the chair opposite her, suddenly aware of how tired he was after the sleepless night. Rebecca pushed Eleanor's Bible toward him, open to a page marked with a scrap of cloth. "Your offer," Garrett said, eyeing the book. "To teach me." "Still stands," she replied. He hesitated, decades of pride warring with practical necessity, and perhaps something more, a quiet desire to finally access the words that had meant so much to Eleanor. "All right," he finally said. "Show me." Rebecca smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and moved her chair closer to his. "We'll start with the basics. Letters, then simple words." The lesson began awkwardly, Garrett's calloused fingers clumsily tracing the shapes of letters he'd seen all his life, but never truly understood. Rebecca was patient, guiding him without condescension, explaining the sounds associated with each symbol. To his surprise, Garrett found himself a quick study. His memory had always been exceptional, a necessity for a scout who needed to recall terrain and track signs with perfect accuracy. That same ability now served him well as he began to connect letters to sounds, sounds to words. As the afternoon wore on, the lesson shifted from basic letters to simple verses from the Bible. Rebecca selected passages Eleanor had marked, and something in Garrett's chest tightened when he recognized in halting syllables words he'd heard his wife read aloud countless times. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read slowly. "I shall not want." "Very good," Rebecca encouraged. "You have a natural ear for it." Garrett shook his head, just remembering Eleanor's voice. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the soft sound of falling snow against the cabin above, and the occasional crackle from the small stove in the corner of the safe room. "How did you learn?" Garrett asked eventually. "At the orphanage, you said—" Rebecca nodded, her expression softening at the memory. "There was a teacher, Miss Hayes. She came once a week to give lessons. Most of the staff saw reading as a frivolity for orphans destined for service or manual labor, but Miss Hayes insisted." Her fingers traced the edge of the Bible. "She smuggled in books for those of us who showed aptitude, said education was the one thing no one could take from us." A shadow crossed her face. She was dismissed when the headmistress found her teaching us poetry instead of practical skills. "What happened to you after the orphanage?" Garrett's question was direct, but not unkind. Rebecca's gaze grew distant. "I worked. Laundry, mostly. Then, as a shop girl, saved every penny. Her voice strengthened. I was headed to Oregon to claim a teaching position, a small school in a logging community. They were desperate enough to hire a woman with my limited credentials. You'll still get there, Garrett said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Rebecca met his eyes, her own filled with a complex mixture of hope and doubt. Perhaps. She closed the Bible gently. What about you? After the war, Garrett leaned back, unaccustomed to speaking about himself, but finding strangely that he wanted to answer. Drifted, worked cattle drives, scouted for the army again for a time, mapping territories. Then met Eleanor in Denver. She was a preacher's daughter with a mind of her own. A ghost of a smile touched his lips at the memory. Married in 68, came here in 70, built this place together. The smile faded. Lost them in 73, been alone since. Rebecca absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. And the watch, the one you polish each morning but never open. Garrett stiffened, surprised she'd noticed. How did you? I see more than people expect, she said simply. Habit from the orphanage, survival skill. He considered deflecting, changing the subject, but something in her direct gaze made prevarication seem pointless. Eleanor and Emily gave it to me, just before they fell ill, my birthday. And you don't open it because, made a vow, he said quietly. The day I buried them. Wouldn't open it until I found a reason to move forward again. A purpose. Rebecca nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. A sacred promise. Something like that. The conversation lapsed into silence again, but it was a different quality of silence than before, less guarded, more companionable. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the early winter darkness settled over the land. Garrett rose to light the lantern, aware that they'd spent hours in conversation, the longest he'd talked with another person in years. It felt strange, but not entirely unwelcome. I should check the property, he said, moving toward the stairs. Mr. Sullivan, Rebecca called after him. Thank you for the lesson and for listening. Garrett nodded once, uncomfortable with gratitude. We'll continue tomorrow, if you're willing. I am. And as he closed the trapdoor behind him, Garrett was struck by the realization that for the first time since Eleanor and Emily's deaths, he'd spent an afternoon thinking about something other than survival or the past. The weight of solitude so familiar, it had become almost unnoticeable, seemed suddenly more apparent by its momentary absence. Outside, the snow had transformed the world into a landscape of white and shadow. Garrett made his rounds, checking the barn and outbuildings, his footprints the only mark on the pristine surface. The cold air burned his lungs, a reminder of the harsh season ahead. Wyoming winters where unforgiving food would be limited, and now he had another person to consider. Yet, as he returned to the cabin rifle cradled in his arms, Garrett found himself less troubled by these practical concerns than by the unexpected shift in his carefully ordered existence, a shift brought about by a woman with old scars and clear eyes who had offered to teach him to read and asked nothing in return but safety. The stars emerged one by one as the clouds parted cold and brilliant against the black sky. Garrett paused on the porch, allowing himself a rare moment of stillness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, the night was peaceful, the ranch secure, and somewhere within himself a door, long closed, had opened just enough to let in a draft of something that might with time resemble hope. 3 days passed in relative calm. The snow continued intermittently accumulating in drifts against the north side of the buildings. Garrett maintained his vigilance, but no sign of the Viper gang appeared on his property. It was as if the wilderness had swallowed them, though he knew better than to believe they had abandoned their pursuit. Each afternoon, he descended to the safe room for reading lessons with Rebecca. Her teaching was patient and methodical, and Garrett found himself making surprising progress. The letters were becoming familiar friends, rather than indecipherable symbols and simple words emerged from the previously mysterious text of Eleanor's Bible. On the fourth night, a fierce storm descended on the ranch. Wind howled around the cabin's eaves, driving snow against the windows with such force it seemed determined to find entry. The temperature plummeted, and Garrett fed the fire continuously to maintain warmth in the small space. Below in the safe room, Rebecca huddled beneath extra blankets, listening to the tempest rage above. The stone walls provided insulation, but the bitter cold still penetrated, and the sounds of the storm, muffled but audible, created an atmosphere of isolation that pressed on her like a physical weight. Sleep eluded her. Each time she closed her eyes, the darkness behind her lids filled with images: the Viper Gang's attack on the wagon train, the days of captivity, the scarred face of their leader, watching her with cold calculation. She tossed restlessly on the narrow cot, the Bible clutched to her chest, like a talisman against the night. Around midnight, a particularly violent gust shook the cabin, and Rebecca sat upright, gasping from a nightmare she couldn't fully recall, but that left her heart racing. The lantern had burned low, casting just enough light to define the edges of the small space. Suddenly, the silence below the storm's fury seemed oppressive, the walls too close, the air too thick. She needed water space, a moment of movement, to dispel the lingering tendrils of the dream. Rebecca lit a candle from the lantern's fading flame and made her way up the stairs. She listened carefully at the trap door before lifting it slightly. The main room of the cabin was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace. Garrett was nowhere to be seen, likely in his small bedroom or making rounds despite the storm. She emerged cautiously, replacing the rug over the trap door. The cabin was cold away from the hearth, and she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders as she moved to the kitchen area. A pitcher of water stood on the counter, and she poured a small amount into a cup, her hands shaking slightly from the chill and the remnants of fear from her dream. As she drank, a sound outside the window caught her attention, a scraping noise like a boot on the porch boards. Rebecca froze, cup halfway to her lips. It could be Garrett returning from a check of the property, but something in the furtive quality of the sound raised the hairs on the back of her neck. She set the cup down silently and moved toward the window, staying close to the wall. Outside, the storm had momentarily abated, allowing the moon to illuminate the snow-covered yard. A shadow moved across the white expanse, a figure approaching the barn bent against the wind. Not Garrett. This man was shorter, bulkier, and moved with a lurching gait. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced toward the door. Garrett's rifle was gone, indicating he was indeed outside, probably unaware of the intruder. The revolver he'd given her was still in the safe room below. A crash from the direction of the barn galvanized her into action. She moved quickly to the trap door, intending to retrieve the weapon, but before she could lift the rug, the cabin door burst open, admitting a swirl of snow, and a man wearing a snow-crusted coat and a bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth. Rebecca stood frozen by the hearth as the intruder's eyes found her. They widened in recognition, then narrowed with a predatory gleam. "Well, well," he drawled, pushing the door closed behind him. "The boss said you might be here. Thought he was crazy, but looks like you've been hiding right under our noses." He pulled the bandana down, revealing a face Rebecca recognized with a jolt of terror. One of the Viper Gang, a man called Maddox, who had been particularly cruel during her captivity. "Don't scream," Maddox warned, drawing a knife from his belt. "Do what I say, and this can go easy." Rebecca backed away, scanning the room for a weapon. "Where's Mr. Sullivan?" Maddox grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "My partner's keeping him busy at the barn. Man your age in this weather won't put up much of a fight." Anger flared through Rebecca's fear. "You don't know him very well." "Don't need to." Maddox advanced, knife held low. "Just need to get you back to the boss. He's been real anxious to continue your education." Rebecca's back hit the table. Her hand closed around the first object. It found a heavy iron skillet left to cool by the stove. As Maddox lunged forward, she swung with all her strength. The pan connected with his outstretched arm, sending the knife clattering to the floor. Maddox howled in pain and rage. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She darted past him toward the door, but he recovered quickly, grabbing a fistful of her hair and yanking her backward. Fire exploded across her scalp. As she hit the floor hard, the wind knocked from her lungs. Maddox loomed over her face, contorted with fury. "Bitch!" he spat. "Boss wants you alive, but he didn't say nothing about undamaged." He raised a boot to strike her. Rebecca rolled, scrambling toward the corner, where she knew Garrett kept a hunting knife. Her fingers closed around the handle just as Maddox grabbed her ankle, dragging her back. With a desperate twist, Rebecca slashed blindly. The blade connected, slicing across Maddox's forearm. He screamed, releasing her leg, and she kicked out, catching him in the knee. As he staggered, Rebecca tried to rise, but pain shot through her ankle where he had gripped it. She stumbled into the table, sending cups and plates crashing to the floor. Maddox recovered his balance, blood streaming from the cut on his arm. His eyes had gone cold with murderous intent. "You'll pay for that." He advanced again, but before he could reach her, the door flew open once more. Silhouetted against the swirling snow stood Garrett Sullivan, rifle raised. Without hesitation, he fired. The shot thundered in the confined space, and Maddox spun backward, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had struck. He crashed into the hearth, sending embers scattering across the floor. Garrett entered swiftly, keeping the rifle trained on the wounded man. "Move again," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "And the next one goes through your heart." Maddox froze, his face pale beneath the dirt and blood. Garrett glanced at Rebecca, noting her defensive posture and the knife still clutched in her hand. "You all right?" She nodded, though her ankle throbbed and her scalp burned where Maddox had pulled her hair. "Your barn taken care of," Garrett said grimly. "His partner won't be reporting back." He moved to Rebecca's side, keeping the rifle aimed at Maddox. "Can you walk?" She tested her weight on the injured ankle, wincing but nodding. "Yes." "Good. Get what you need from below. We're leaving." Rebecca looked at him in surprise. "Now, in the storm. They found us once. They'll send more when these two don't return." Garrett's expression was resolute. "We need to reach town before they regroup." Understanding the logic. Rebecca hurried to the trapdoor, descending to gather her few possessions, the revolver, a change of clothes Garrett had provided, and Eleanor's Bible. When she returned, Garrett had bound Maddox's hands and feet with rope and gagged him with a strip of cloth. "He stays," Garrett explained. "His partners will waste time looking for him here while we get a head start." He helped Rebecca into a heavy coat, Eleanor's, she realized with a pang, and wrapped a woolen scarf around her head and neck. Outside, the storm had lessened somewhat, though snow still fell steadily. 2 horses waited, saddled and laden with supplies. Garrett assisted Rebecca onto the smaller one, a steady bay mare, before mounting his own black gelding. With a last look at the cabin, his home for nearly a decade, Garrett Sullivan turned his horse toward the east and the distant promise of safety, leaving behind the solitude he had cultivated for so long, and embracing however reluctantly, a path that led back toward the world of men. As they rode into the snowy night, Rebecca glanced back once at the cabin, now just a dark shape against the white landscape. Within its walls, a man lay bound a temporary victory in what she feared would be a long and bloody conflict. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and perhaps a reckoning long overdue. She turned forward again, focusing on Garrett's straight back as he led the way through the deepening snow. Whatever came next, they would face it together, two wounded souls finding unexpected strength in shared purpose. They rode through the night, the cold moon casting blue shadows across the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline stillness broken only by the sound of their horses' labored breathing and the crunch of hooves through fresh powder. Garrett set a careful pace, mindful of the treacherous footing and Rebecca's injured ankle. He knew these hills intimately, every draw, every ridge, every hidden path that might offer protection from pursuing eyes. They followed game trails where possible, keeping to the tree line when crossing open ground, and stopping frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit. By dawn, they had covered perhaps 10 miles, not the distance Garrett had hoped for, but respectable given the conditions. The eastern sky lightened to a pale gray, then blossomed with streaks of pink and gold that set the snow-covered pines aglow. "We'll rest here," Garrett said, reining in beside a sheltered overhang of rock that formed a natural windbreak. "Horses need it. So do you." Rebecca nodded gratefully, her face pale with fatigue and pain. The night's ride had taken its toll. Garrett helped her dismount, noting her wince as her injured ankle took her weight. "Let me see that," he said, gesturing to her foot after securing the horses. Rebecca sat on a fallen log while Garrett knelt to examine her ankle. It was swollen but not discolored, a sprain rather than a break, but painful nonetheless. He rewrapped it tightly with a strip of cloth from his saddlebag. "It'll hold," he said, rising. 2 days to Stone Creek if the weather holds." "And if it doesn't?" Rebecca asked, accepting the jerky and hardtack he offered. 3, maybe 4. Garrett surveyed the sky, reading the clouds with the expertise of a man whose life had often depended on predicting the weather. "More snow coming. Tonight, likely." Rebecca chewed the tough jerky, slowly conserving her energy. "Will they follow?" "Count on it." Garrett's expression was grim. "Vance isn't a man who gives up easily." "You really knew him?" "During the war." It wasn't a question, but Garrett nodded anyway. "Knew of him first, his reputation, then had the misfortune of meeting him personally." He settled beside her on the log rifle across his knees, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "We were scouts, gathering intelligence behind Confederate lines near Shiloh. 8 of us. Good men." The memory was sharper than he'd expected, cutting through the layers of time he'd buried it beneath. "We were betrayed, ambushed, taken to a farmhouse Vance was using as headquarters." Rebecca watched his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the distant look in his eyes, as he revisited a past he'd tried to forget. "He questioned us personally, one by one." Garrett's voice had gone flat. "First man was Jackson, Tennessee boy who'd sided with the Union. Vance worked on him for hours. We could hear—" He trailed off, the sounds of that long-ago torture too vivid to voice. "When they brought what was left of Jackson back, Vance came in to show us. Said that's what happened to traitors to the South." "How did you escape?" Rebecca asked softly. "Didn't. Not then." Garrett's hand unconsciously moved to his side, where the old bullet wound lay hidden beneath layers of clothing. "We were there 3 days. 3 men died during questioning. 2 were executed after Vance got what he wanted. And you—" Third night Union artillery started shelling nearby, created confusion. The guard got careless. A ghost of a smile touched Garrett's lips. Man never should have turned his back on a scout, even a half-dead one. The smile faded. Made it out with Miller and Thompson. Thompson died from his wounds before we reached our lines. Miller and I reported what we'd seen, what Vance had done. He fell silent, the weight of memory pressing down like the cold that surrounded them. What happened to Vance after the war? Rebecca asked after a long moment. Officially pardoned by President Johnson like many Confederate officers, then died in a fire in Richmond in '66. Garrett's expression hardened. I never believed it. Spent 2 years looking for him before the trail went cold. Rebecca absorbed this, connecting it to her own experiences with the man. And now he's here. The Viper Gang. Seems so. Garrett stood restless with the energy of suppressed anger. Question is why? Why now? Why here? And why you? Rebecca looked down at her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible over the whisper of wind through the pines. Because I betrayed him. Garrett turned to her eyes, narrowing. What? Rebecca met his gaze, a complex mixture of shame and defiance in her expression. I wasn't just a random victim, Mr. Sullivan. I worked for him. Not willingly, but I did. The confession hung in the cold air between them. Garrett's hand tightened on his rifle, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. After the orphanage, I had nowhere to go, took work where I could find it. Rebecca's voice strengthened as she committed to her story. Was working as a laundress in Fort Laramie when they came. Vance and his men. They needed someone who could move among proper society without raising suspicion. A decoy, Garrett said flatly. Rebecca nodded. I'd approach wagons, trains, spinning tales of being separated from my family needing help. Once they took me in, I'd learn the route, what valuables they carried. Then at night, she didn't need to finish. Garrett could imagine the rest, the ambush, the robbery, the violence that followed. How many? He asked, his voice hard. 3 wagons, trains. Rebecca didn't flinch from his judgment. No one was supposed to be hurt. That was the agreement. But the 3rd time, they killed 2 men who resisted. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. I tried to leave after that. Vance wouldn't let me. Said I knew too much, that I belonged to him now. So what changed? Why were they bringing you to Fort Rock? Rebecca's face darkened. They started taking children. From the last wagon train. Said they'd fetch good prices in certain establishments. One girl, Mary, couldn't have been more than 10. She reminded me of myself at that age. Understanding dawned on Garrett's face. You helped her escape. I tried. Rebecca wiped away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts. Got her away from camp one night. Told her to run east, that she'd find the main trail by morning. Her voice caught. Vance discovered us. Caught me. The girl got away, but she gestured vaguely to her bruised face. Said I'd broken our arrangement. That if I wasn't going to be useful as a decoy anymore, I'd be useful in other ways. He was taking me to Fort Rock when they thought someone was following. That's when they left me in your shed. Silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional snort from the horses and the distant cry of a hawk circling above the valley. Garrett studied Rebecca, reassessing everything he thought he knew about her. Why tell me this now? He finally asked. Because you deserve the truth. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. And because if we're going to survive Vance, you need to know exactly who you're dealing with, what he's capable of. Garrett nodded slowly, acknowledging the painful honesty of her confession. The girl, Mary, you think she made it? A flicker of hope crossed Rebecca's face. I pray she did. And the mark. Garrett gestured to her collarbone, where the star-shaped scar lay hidden beneath her clothing. You weren't lying about that. No, Rebecca said firmly. That came from the orphanage just as I said. Iron rod heated in the fire, punishment for spilled water. Garrett absorbed this, weighing her story against his instincts. He had spent years reading people judging character from the smallest tells. Rebecca's confession rang true, not just the words, but the pain and shame behind them. We should move, he said, finally offering his hand to help her up. Still a long way to Stone Creek. Rebecca took his hand, relief evident in her expression. She had expected judgment, perhaps even abandonment. Instead, Garrett Sullivan had listened, evaluated, and made his decision. As they mounted their horses and continued eastward, Rebecca felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The truth had been spoken, her sins acknowledged. Whatever came next, she would face it, without the burden of deception. Garrett rode slightly ahead, his broad shoulders set against the biting wind that had begun to rise from the north. Fresh snow clouds gathered on the horizon, promising another difficult night. But for the moment, the path was clear, the horses were strong, and two travelers moved forward together, each carrying their own burdens, but sharing, perhaps for the first time, an honest understanding of the other. By midday, the weather turned against them. The promised snow began earlier than Garrett had predicted starting, as scattered flakes that quickly intensified into blinding sheets of white. The wind rose to a howl, driving the snow horizontally and reducing visibility to mere yards. Need to find shelter, Garrett shouted over the wind's fury. Can't continue in this. Rebecca nodded, her face nearly hidden beneath the scarf wrapped around her head. The cold had penetrated her layers of clothing, settling into her bones with an ache that seemed permanent. Her hands, despite the thick gloves Garrett had provided, had gone numb on the reins. They pressed on through the worsening conditions, Garrett leading them toward a line of dark shapes that gradually resolved into a dense stand of pines. Within the trees, the force of the wind diminished somewhat, though the snow continued to fall heavily. There, Garrett pointed to a dark opening in a rocky hillside, partly concealed by fallen timber. Old bear den, used it before. They dismounted with difficulty, their joints stiff from cold and the long hours of riding. Garrett checked the cave entrance, carefully rifle-ready, but it appeared long abandoned by its original inhabitants. It was shallow, but dry, the floor covered with old pine needles. Get inside, he instructed Rebecca. I'll see to the horses. While Rebecca huddled just inside the entrance, Garrett unsaddled the animals and secured them in a natural enclosure formed by fallen trees and the rock face. He covered them with blankets from his pack, ensuring they had protection from the worst of the elements. By the time he joined Rebecca in the cave, his beard was crusted with ice, and his hands shook with cold. Still, he moved with purpose, gathering dried pine branches from the cave floor and the surrounding area. With flint and steel from his pack, he soon had a small fire burning its light, casting flickering shadows on the rock walls. It's not much, he said, but it'll keep us from freezing. Rebecca moved closer to the flames, extending her hands gratefully toward the warmth. It's more than I expected. Thank you. They sat in silence for a time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the muffled howl of the wind outside. Garrett prepared a meager meal from their supplies, more jerky, hard biscuits, and coffee brewed in a small tin pot. As they ate, Rebecca studied Garrett's face in the firelight. The hard lines seemed deeper than before, his eyes shadowed with fatigue and something else. A preoccupation that went beyond their immediate circumstances. Something's troubling you, she observed. Beyond the storm and Vance. Garrett looked up, surprised by her perception. "What makes you say that? You keep touching your side, where you were wounded." Rebecca set her coffee aside. "And you've checked your saddlebag 3 times since we stopped, making sure it's still there." A rueful expression crossed Garrett's face. "You notice a lot." "Survival skill," she reminded him. Garrett was silent for a long moment, seeming to debate with himself. Finally, he reached for his saddlebag and withdrew a small oilskin packet bound with leather cord. "What I didn't tell you about Vance," he began, holding the packet carefully, "was what he was really after during those interrogations." Rebecca waited, sensing the importance of what was to come. "Our unit had intercepted a Confederate courier," Garrett continued. "He was carrying documents, a ledger with names. Confederate agents planted in the North, some in very high positions, and a cipher key to decode their communications." He unwrapped the oilskin, revealing a single yellowed page covered in neat handwriting. "This is a copy of one page from that ledger, the only copy that survived." "You kept it?" Rebecca asked, surprised. "All these years." Garrett nodded, turned the original over to Union intelligence. "But this page, it had a name I recognized. Man who'd betrayed our position to Vance. Thought I might find him myself someday." "Did you—" "No." Garrett's expression darkened. "Trail went cold, just like with Vance. War-ended country wanted to heal. Hunting Confederate spies wasn't a priority anymore." Rebecca considered this new information. "And you think that's why Vance is after you now?" "This page, maybe." Garrett carefully rewrapped the document. "Or maybe it's simpler than that. Revenge. I escaped. Survived to report what he'd done. Ruined whatever plans he had for after the war."
"What does the page say?"
Rebecca asked, curiosity overcoming caution. "The names." Garrett hesitated, then handed her the packet. "See for yourself. If we're in this together, you should know what we're up against." Rebecca unwrapped the page with careful fingers. The handwriting was precise, military in its orderliness. It listed names, locations, and code designations. Most meant nothing to her, but halfway down one entry caught her eye: Harlow J., Missouri border. Designate watchman. Deep cover Union sympathizer. Family valuable position. Her breath caught. "Harlow." Garrett nodded, watching her closely. "Common enough name, might be no relation." "My father was James Harlow," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He died when I was 6. Missouri border country. Mother said it was raiders, but she never would talk about it." She looked up, meeting Garrett's gaze. "Are you saying he was a Confederate spy?" "According to that page, yes." Garrett's tone was neutral. "Or he could have been a Union man with the same name. War created a lot of confusion, a lot of mistaken identities." Rebecca stared at the name, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath her. Everything she thought she knew about her past suddenly seemed uncertain. "After he died, Mother brought me east. Took sick in Pennsylvania. That's how I ended up in the orphanage." She traced the name with her fingertip, as if physical contact might yield more information. "I barely remember him. Just fragments. A deep voice. The smell of tobacco. A pocket watch he let me hold sometimes." Garrett took the page back gently, returning it to its protective covering. "War made ghosts of a lot of good men, and monsters of others." "Like Vance," Rebecca said. "Like Vance," Garrett agreed. They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts, as the fire burned low. Outside, the storm continued unabated, sealing them in their temporary sanctuary with newly shared secrets and the weight of the past. Eventually, Rebecca spoke again. "The man who betrayed your unit. The one you were looking for. What was his name? Garrett looked into the flames, his expression hardening. Lieutenant Marcus Harlow, James Harlow's brother, according to our intelligence. The revelation hung in the air between them. Rebecca's uncle, a man she'd never known existed, had betrayed Garrett's unit to Vance, leading to the torture and death of his comrades. "I'm sorry," she said finally, the words inadequate but sincere. Garrett nodded once in acknowledgement. "It was a long time ago." "But not long enough to forget," Rebecca observed softly. "Some things a man doesn't forget," Garrett agreed. "Just learns to live with." He added more branches to the fire, sending a shower of sparks upward. "You should rest. I'll take first watch." Rebecca wanted to protest that he needed rest more than she did, but the exhaustion of the day's journey had caught up with her. She settled onto the pine needle bed, using her saddle as a pillow, and pulled the blanket Garrett offered over her shoulders. As she drifted toward sleep, she found herself wondering about James Harlow, the father she barely remembered, the man whose name appeared on a list of Confederate agents. Had he been a spy, as the document suggested? Or was it truly a case of mistaken identity? And what would it mean if Vance discovered the connection? If he already knew? These troubling questions followed Rebecca into uneasy dreams, where men with scarred faces pursued her through endless forests of Stoy, calling her father's name. They departed the cave at first light, though light was a generous term for the gray dimness that penetrated the continuing snowfall. The storm had weakened overnight, but hadn't passed entirely, leaving a fresh blanket of white across the landscape and reducing visibility to less than a quarter mile. Garrett estimated they had covered nearly half the distance to Stone Creek. With luck and good weather, they might reach the town by nightfall. But luck had been in short supply lately, and the weather showed no signs of improvement. They rode in silence for the most part, conserving energy in the bitter cold. Garrett led the way, choosing their path with the careful deliberation of a man who knew both the terrain and the dangers it presented. He selected routes that offered cover, where possible avoided ridgelines where they might be silhouetted against the sky, and periodically doubled back to check for signs of pursuit. By midday, the snow had finally stopped, though heavy clouds still hung low over the mountains. They paused in a small clearing to rest the horses and eat a sparse meal of the remaining jerky. Rebecca's ankle had stiffened during the night, making mounting and dismounting a painful ordeal, but she offered no complaint. "How much farther?" she asked, stamping her feet to restore circulation. 10 miles, maybe 12, Garrett replied, scanning the horizon. "Difficult country ahead, narrow pass through those hills." He nodded toward a gap between two snow-covered peaks. "Only practical route to Stone Creek from this direction." Rebecca followed his gaze, understanding the implication. "A natural place for an ambush." "Yes," Garrett's expression was grim, "but avoiding it would cost us a day, maybe 2. Time we don't have with supplies running low." "So we take our chances with the pass," Rebecca concluded. Garrett nodded. "We stay alert, move quickly. Hope the snow has slowed them as much as it's slowed us." They mounted again and continued eastward, the terrain gradually rising as they approached the foothills. The path narrowed, forcing them to ride single file through stands of pine and around massive boulders that jutted from the snow like the bones of ancient creatures. As they neared the entrance to the pass, Garrett halted, studying the landscape ahead with narrowed eyes. The passage was perhaps 50 yards wide at its mouth, narrowing to less than 20 yards at its center. Steep rock walls rose on either side, offering numerous ledges and crevices where an ambush might be staged. "Stay close," he instructed Rebecca. "If shooting starts, ride hard. Don't stop. Don't look back." She nodded, her face pale but determined. "And you?" Garrett checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded and ready. "I'll be right behind you," They entered the pass cautiously, every sense alert for danger. The only sounds were the soft crunch of snow beneath the horses' hooves and the occasional call of a raven circling high above. The shadows between the rocks seemed to deepen as they advanced, and Rebecca felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them. Halfway through the narrowest section, Garrett suddenly reined in, raising his hand in a signal to stop. Rebecca halted beside him, following his gaze to a fresh track in the snow, a horse's hoof print partially filled with blown snow, but clearly made since the storm had passed. Before either could speak, the crack of a rifle shot echoed through the pass. Snow exploded from a rock, inches from Garrett's head. "Ride!" he shouted, wheeling his horse and firing toward a ledge where a puff of smoke revealed the shooter's position. Rebecca spurred her mare forward as more shots rang out bullets whining past her. She glanced back to see Garrett returning fire, his face set in a mask of concentration amid the chaos. 3 riders appeared at the far end of the pass, blocking their escape route. They wore the familiar bandanas of the Viper gang, and the lead rider raised his rifle, taking careful aim at Rebecca. Garrett's shot caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. The other 2 scattered, seeking cover among the rocks while still firing. "This way," Garrett called, gesturing toward a narrow side path that Rebecca hadn't noticed. They veered toward it, bullets kicking up snow around them. As they reached the path's entrance, a shot rang out from directly above. Garrett jerked in the saddle, a crimson stain blossoming on his coat near his left shoulder. Despite the wound, he managed to raise his rifle and fire upward, dislodging a figure from the rocks. The side path proved to be little more than a game trail, barely wide enough for the horses to navigate single file. It wound upward along the canyon wall, exposed and treacherous. Behind them, shouts and the pounding of hooves indicated pursuit. Garrett swayed in the saddle, his face ashen beneath his beard, but he continued to urge his horse forward. Blood dripped from his sleeve, leaving a trail of scarlet drops in the snow. "You're hit," Rebecca called, fear evident in her voice. "Keep moving," Garrett ground out through clenched teeth. "Nearly through." The path crested a ridge, then descended sharply into a wooded valley beyond. As they reached the top, Garrett turned for one last shot at their pursuers. The effort cost him his precarious balance, and he slid sideways from the saddle, catching himself against his horse's neck before falling completely. Rebecca reined in beside him, reaching to steady him. "I've got you." With her help, Garrett righted himself, though his breathing had grown labored, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. 2 miles east, he managed. Old trapper's cabin. Stone chimney. They descended into the valley, the trees providing cover from further gunfire. The pursuit seemed to have fallen back, perhaps deterred by Garrett's accurate shooting, or uncertain of the path ahead. By the time they located the cabin, a small dilapidated structure half hidden among the pines, Garrett was barely conscious. The front of his coat was soaked with blood, and his skin had taken on a gray pallor that frightened Rebecca more than the ambush had. She helped him dismount, supporting his weight as he staggered toward the cabin door. Inside, the air was musty and cold, but the roof was intact, and the stone fireplace promised warmth if they could get a fire started. Garrett collapsed onto a crude wooden bench, his breathing shallow. "Check outside," he whispered. "Make sure we weren't followed." Rebecca hesitated, torn between the need to secure their position and the urgency of tending to his wound. Finally, she nodded, retrieving his rifle before stepping back outside. The valley lay quiet under its blanket of snow. No tracks marred the pristine white surface beyond their own, and no sounds disturbed the stillness except the soft nickering of the horses. After securing the animals in a lean-to attached to the cabin, Rebecca gathered firewood from a weathered pile beneath the eaves. Inside, she found Garrett had managed to remove his coat, revealing the full extent of the damage. The bullet had entered just below his collarbone, leaving a neat hole that belied the severity of the internal injury. Blood continued to seep from the wound, staining his shirt a deep crimson. "Through and through," he said, his voice stronger than she expected. "Missed anything vital, I think." Rebecca built a fire with shaking hands, relief flooding through her when the dry pine caught and flames leapt upward. Once assured of warmth, she turned her full attention to Garrett's wound. "I need to clean it," she said, gathering supplies from his saddlebag. "It's going to hurt." Garrett managed a grim smile. "Not my first bullet." Using water melted from snow and a small flask of whiskey Garrett had packed, Rebecca cleaned the entry and exit wounds as gently as possible. Garrett remained stoically silent throughout, though sweat beaded on his forehead and his hands clenched into fists at the worst moments. When she had finished bandaging the injury with strips torn from a clean shirt, Rebecca helped Garrett to the cabin's only bed, a simple frame with a straw-filled mattress that had remarkably remained dry and relatively clean. "Rest," she urged, covering him with blankets from their packs. "I'll keep watch." Garrett caught her wrist with surprising strength. "Rebecca," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If I don't make it—" "You will," she interrupted firmly. "If I don't," he insisted, "take the page. Get it to Sheriff Montgomery in Stone Creek. Tell him everything about Vance, the Viper gang, everything." Rebecca nodded reluctantly. "I will, but it won't come to that." Garrett released her wrist, his eyes already closing as exhaustion and blood loss took their toll. "Hope you're right." As darkness fell outside the cabin windows, Rebecca sat beside the fire, Garrett's rifle across her knees, listening to his labored breathing and the occasional pop of sap in the burning pine. The ambush had been too well coordinated, too precise. The Viper gang hadn't stumbled upon them by chance, they had known exactly where to wait, which meant they knew where Garrett and Rebecca were headed, and if they knew that Stone Creek might not offer the sanctuary they sought. But for now, survival depended on getting through the night. Rebecca added another log to the fire, settled more comfortably against the wall, and prepared for a long vigil. Outside, snow began to fall again, softly at first, then with increasing intensity, as if nature itself were trying to erase all evidence of their passing through this remote wilderness. The fever began around midnight. Garrett's skin, previously cool and clammy, turned hot to the touch. He tossed restlessly on the narrow bed, murmuring incoherently, occasionally calling out names: Eleanor, Emily, comrades, long dead. Rebecca bathed his forehead with cool cloths, changed his bandages when blood seeped through, and coaxed water between his cracked lips whenever he was lucid enough to swallow. Outside, the storm had intensified again, wind howling around the cabin's eaves and driving snow through small gaps in the walls. The temperature plummeted, and despite the fire, Rebecca maintained cold drafts invaded every corner of the small space. She piled their remaining blankets over Garrett and wore her coat indoors, moving constantly between tending him, feeding the fire, and checking the perimeter. By the darkest hours before dawn, Garrett's condition had worsened. His breathing grew shallow and rapid, and the skin around his wound showed angry red streaks, the beginning of infection. Rebecca searched his saddlebags desperately for anything that might help, finding a small tin of dried herbs she recognized as yarrow. Eleanor must have packed it. The plant was known for its ability to fight infection and reduce fever. She brewed a strong tea from the herbs, supporting Garrett's head as she urged him to drink. Most of it dribbled down his beard, but he managed to swallow some, coughing weakly afterward. "Eleanor," he murmured, his eyes unfocused. "It's Rebecca," she corrected gently. "Eleanor's not here." Confusion crossed his feverish face. "She was just here, with Emily." Rebecca's heart ached at the raw grief in his voice. They're at peace, Garrett. They're watching over you. He seemed to accept this, his eyes drifting closed again. Told them I'd find a reason. A reason, Rebecca prompted, hoping to keep him talking to anchor him to the present. To open the watch, he whispered. To live again. Understanding dawned. The pocket watch he carried, but never opened his promise to Eleanor and Emily that he would find purpose beyond grief. Rebecca reached into his coat, which hung nearby, and carefully extracted the silver timepiece. It gleamed in the firelight, a small, perfect circle of polished metal. She held it up where Garrett could see it, his eyes flickering open at the movement. It's safe, she assured him. Just like you asked. Relief crossed his features. Not ready yet, he murmured. Not yet. No, Rebecca agreed, returning the watch to his coat. But someday. As the night wore on, Rebecca found herself talking to Garrett, unsure if he could hear but needing to fill the silence with something other than the wind's mournful keening. She told him about her childhood in the orphanage, the small acts of rebellion that had earned her punishments, and the dreams that had sustained her through the darkest times. I wanted to be a teacher, she confessed, stoking the fire to drive back the encroaching cold. Imagined having my own little schoolhouse somewhere. Children who'd look up to me instead of past me like I was invisible. She described the books Miss Hayes had smuggled to her, tales of adventure and far-off places that had transported her beyond the orphanage's grim walls. How she'd read them by candlelight after the other girls were asleep, savoring each word like it was precious gold. That's why teaching you to read matters so much, she told Garrett's still form. Words are freedom. They let you escape, even when your body's trapped. The confession felt intimate in the darkness, with only the crackling fire as witness. Rebecca continued, finding a strange comfort in giving voice to thoughts long held private. When I left the orphanage, I promised myself I'd never be at anyone's mercy again. Bitterness crept into her tone. Look how well that turned out. First job, first kind word, from a man who seemed to see me, and I walked right into Vance's trap. She changed the cloth on Garrett's forehead, noting with concern that his fever seemed no better, despite the herbal tea. But I'm done being used, she said with quiet determination. Done being afraid. Whatever happens when we reach Stone Creek, I'm facing it on my terms. Outside, the wind's fury gradually diminished as dawn approached. The storm was passing, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. Inside the cabin, Rebecca sang softly a lullaby her mother had sung before illness took her, one of the few clear memories Rebecca retained of the woman. The melody, simple and haunting, filled the small space with unexpected warmth. Garrett's restless movements calmed somewhat, his breathing becoming more regular as the song continued. Whether it was the music, the yarrow tea finally taking effect, or simply his own stubborn will to live, his fever seemed to ease slightly as the first pale light of dawn filtered through the cabin's single window. Rebecca moved to check the bandages again and found Garrett's eyes open clearer than they had been all night. You were singing, he said, his voice rough but stronger. Relief washed over her. My mother's song, from when I was very small. Garrett nodded slightly, wincing at the movement. Sounded like home. The simple observation caught Rebecca off guard. Home was a concept so distant, it might as well have been another country, a place she'd been traveling toward her entire life without ever reaching. How do you feel? She asked, deflecting the unexpected emotion his words had stirred. Like I've been shot, Garrett replied dryly. A small laugh escaped her. Fair enough. She helped him drink water, encouraged by his ability to swallow without choking. His fever, while still present, had diminished enough for lucidity to return. "The gang?" he asked after finishing the water. "No sign of them," Rebecca reported. "Storm was heavy all night. Doubt anyone could have tracked us even if they wanted to." Garrett seemed to consider this. "Need to move, today." "You're in no condition." "Can't stay here," he interrupted. "Too exposed. Too well known." He attempted to sit up, falling back with a grimace of pain. "Vance knows about this place. Used it during the war." Rebecca's blood chilled at the implications. "How far to Stone Creek from here? 8 miles, maybe 9. Garrett's gaze was steady despite his weakness. "Mostly downhill. If we leave now, might make it by nightfall." "You can barely sit up," Rebecca protested. "I've ridden in worse condition." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Though not by much." Rebecca wanted to argue further, but recognized the logic behind his urgency. If Vance knew about the cabin, it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. Moving, however difficult, offered better odds than waiting to be found. "Let me check the horses first," she conceded. "See if they're fit to travel." Outside, the world had been transformed into a landscape of pristine white. The storm had dropped at least a foot of fresh snow, obliterating their tracks from the day before, and creating smooth, unbroken drifts around the cabin. The sky had cleared to a pale blue, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the snow's surface. The horses had weathered the night well in their sheltered lean-to. Rebecca fed them the last of the grain from their saddlebags and melted snow for them to drink. By the time she returned to the cabin, Garrett had managed to sit up, though the effort had left him pale and sweating. "I need to rebandage your wound before we leave," she said, gathering the remaining clean cloths. As she worked, Garrett watched her face with an intensity that made her self-conscious. "What is it?" she finally asked. "Thank you," he said simply, "for staying, for the care." The gratitude in his voice made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "You'd have done the same." "Yes," he agreed. "But it's been a long time since anyone did something for me without expecting something in return." Rebecca secured the fresh bandage, avoiding his gaze. "Well, I do expect something." "Oh." She met his eyes, then her expression serious. "I expect you to live Garrett Sullivan. I expect you to keep fighting. And I expect you to finish learning to read, because I've invested too much time in your education to start over with someone else." A genuine smile broke across his weathered face, transforming it completely. "Yes, ma'am." With considerable effort and more pain than he would admit, Garrett managed to dress and prepare for travel. Rebecca packed their meager remaining supplies, banked the fire, and helped him mount his horse, a process that left him gray-faced and breathing in short, controlled gasps. "Stone Creek," he said once he'd regained his composure. "Sheriff Montgomery will help us. Old friend from the war." Rebecca mounted her own horse, positioning herself close beside him in case he weakened. "Then let's not keep him waiting." They set out into the brilliant morning, leaving behind the shelter that had seen them through the darkest night of their journey. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and perhaps a reckoning long overdue. But as they made their way down the snow-covered trail side by side in the strengthening sunlight, Rebecca felt something unexpected stir within her, a sensation so unfamiliar it took her a moment to recognize it. Hope. It was fragile, tentative, like the first green shoot pushing through soil after a long winter. But it was there nonetheless, growing stronger with each mile that carried them toward Stone Creek, and whatever fate awaited them there. Behind them, the small cabin stood empty once more. The only signs of their presence, the dying embers in the fireplace, and twin sets of hoofprints that wound down the valley, soon to be erased by wind and weather, as transient as the humans who had briefly disturbed the wilderness's ancient solitude. The The journey to Stone Creek proved more arduous than either had anticipated. Though the trail descended gradually from the mountains, Garrett's condition deteriorated with each passing mile. By midday, he could barely stay upright in the saddle, his face ashen beneath his beard, lips pressed into a thin line against the pain. Rebecca rode close beside him, occasionally reaching out to steady him when he swayed dangerously. She had tied a lead rope between their horses, ensuring his mount would follow if he lost consciousness entirely. "Not far now," Garrett murmured, his voice barely audible over the soft crunch of snow beneath the horse's hooves. "Next valley." Rebecca nodded, though she wondered if his assessment was accurate or merely wishful thinking. The landscape had become unfamiliar to her, rolling hills covered in snow stands of pine and aspen, occasional rock formations jutting from the white expanse. Without Garrett's guidance, she would be hopelessly lost in this wilderness. Around mid-afternoon, they crested a low ridge, and the valley below finally came into view. Stone Creek, a small settlement nestled along a frozen waterway, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys into the clear winter air. Relief flooded through Rebecca at the sight of civilization after days in the wild. We made it," she said, turning to Garrett, with a smile that faded quickly when she saw his condition. He sat slumped forward, one hand clutched to his wounded shoulder, the other barely maintaining his grip on the reins. His eyes were glazed with fever, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Garrett," she called, alarmed. "Stay with me. We're almost there." He blinked slowly, struggling to focus. "Give me the watch." The request confused her, but she reached into his coat pocket where she had returned the silver timepiece the night before. She placed it in his palm, and his fingers closed around it with surprising strength. "Promised Eleanor," he whispered. "Not until I found a reason." Rebecca understood. Then he feared he wouldn't survive to fulfill his vow. "You're going to be fine," she insisted, though her voice trembled slightly. "Sheriff Montgomery will help us." Garrett nodded faintly, tucking the watch into his shirt pocket close to his heart. "Montgomery, yes. Tell him. Vance. The ledger." "I will," Rebecca promised, "but you'll tell him yourself." They descended toward the town, the horses picking their way carefully down the snowy slope. As they approached the first outlying buildings, Rebecca felt exposed and vulnerable. If Vance had men watching Stone Creek, they would be easily spotted on the open hillside. The town itself was modest, but well established. A main street lined with false-fronted buildings, side streets leading to scattered homes and businesses. A church steeple rose near the center, and at the far end stood a substantial two-story structure with a sign identifying it as the county sheriff's office and jail. People stopped to stare as Rebecca guided the horses down the main street, supporting Garrett with one arm while managing both sets of reins with her free hand. His condition was evident to anyone who looked, the blood-soaked bandages visible at his collar, his pallor, the way he slumped against her. A burly man emerged from the mercantile, stepping into their path with a wary expression. "Hold up there," he called. "What's your business in Stone Creek?" Rebecca reined in, her heart pounding. "This man needs help. Garrett Sullivan. He's looking for Sheriff Montgomery." At the mention of Garrett's name, the man's demeanor changed instantly. "Sullivan." He stepped closer, peering at Garrett's face. "Lord Almighty, it is you." Garrett raised his head with effort. "Davis," he acknowledged weakly. "Need to see Tobias." "Of course." Davis turned to shout toward the sheriff's office. "Someone get the sheriff. Tell him Sullivan's here, and he's hurt bad." Activity erupted around them. Men hurried toward the sheriff's office, while women appeared in doorways, expressions curious or concerned. Rebecca remained tense, scanning the crowds for any sign of Vance's men, but saw only the honest faces of frontier townspeople. A tall figure emerged from the sheriff's office, moving with purpose despite an obvious limp. Sheriff Tobias Montgomery cut an imposing figure even at a distance, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with a presence that commanded attention without effort. Most striking was the empty sleeve pinned neatly at his left shoulder, evidence of a sacrifice made long ago. "Garrett," he called as he approached, his deep voice carrying easily in the cold air. "What the devil happened to you?" Before Garrett could answer, he slumped forward, consciousness finally deserting him. Rebecca caught him as best she could, preventing him from falling from the saddle. "He's been shot," she explained urgently. "The wound's infected. He's burning with fever." Montgomery assessed the situation with a single glance, then began issuing orders with the authority of a man accustomed to crisis. "Davis, fetch Doc Henderson. Jenkins, help get Sullivan to the doctor's office. Miss Harlow," Rebecca supplied. "Rebecca Harlow." "Miss Harlow, come with me. We'll get at him taken care of." Everything happened quickly after that. Willing hands lifted Garrett from his horse and carried him to a small building off the main street that served as the town's medical office. The doctor, a surprisingly young man with spectacles and a gentle manner, immediately set to work examining the wound, while his wife, a capable-looking woman with kind eyes, prepared instruments and medicines. Sheriff Montgomery drew Rebecca aside as the doctor worked. "I need to know what happened," he said, his tone not unkind, but brooking no evasion. "Garrett Sullivan is not a man who gets shot by accident." Rebecca hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. Garrett had trusted this man, but caution had become second nature to her. "We were ambushed in the pass east of here," she began. "Men from a gang called the Vipers." Montgomery's expression darkened. "I've heard of them. Brutal bunch. Rob stagecoaches, wagon trains." He studied her face. "What's their interest in you and Sullivan?" "Their leader," Rebecca said carefully. "A man with a scar from eye to jaw. Garrett called him Ezra Vance." The effect of the name was immediate and profound. Montgomery's weathered face paled, and his hand moved unconsciously to the empty sleeve. "Vance is dead," he said flatly. "Died in Richmond after the war." "He's very much alive," Rebecca countered. "And leading the Viper gang in these territories." Montgomery absorbed this, his expression shifting from disbelief to grim acceptance. "You'd better tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning." Over the next hour, as Dr. Henderson worked to save Garrett's life, Rebecca related their story to the sheriff, how she'd been left in Garrett's shed, their time at the ranch, the attacks, and their journey to Stone Creek. She omitted her own involvement with the Viper gang, and the revelation about her father, uncertain how much Garrett would want, shared. When she finished, Montgomery sat in silence for a long moment, digesting the information. "Vance," he finally said, the name heavy with history. "Never thought I'd hear that name again." "You knew him?" Rebecca asked. "Knew of him during the war?" Montgomery's gaze grew distant. "Encountered his handiwork first-hand at Shiloh. Lost this," he gestured to his missing arm, "and 30 good men to an ambush he orchestrated." Understanding dawned. "That's how you and Garrett met." Montgomery nodded. "We were the only officers who survived. Spent 3 months in the same field hospital." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Stubborn bastard refused to die then, too." The doctor emerged from the examination room, wiping his hands on a cloth. Both Rebecca and Montgomery rose expectantly. "He's stable," Dr. Henderson reported. "Bullet went clean through, missed the major vessels. The infection's what concerns me. I've cleaned the wound thoroughly and given him laudanum for the pain." "Will he recover?" Rebecca asked, her voice small. The doctor adjusted his spectacles. "Hard to say with certainty. He's lost a lot of blood and the fever's quite high. But he's strong, and the wound itself isn't as severe as it could have been." He offered a reassuring smile. "I've seen men pull through from worse." Relief washed over Rebecca. "Can I see him?" "He's sleeping now, but yes, briefly." The doctor gestured toward the door. "My wife has prepared a room for you at our home. You look exhausted yourself." Rebecca hadn't considered her own condition, but now that the immediate crisis had passed, fatigue settled over her like a heavy blanket. Still, she shook her head. "I should stay with him." "There's nothing more you can do tonight," Dr. Henderson said gently. "Rest. He'll need you stronger when he wakes." Sheriff Montgomery placed a hand on her shoulder. "Doctor's right. I'll post a deputy outside. No one will get to him, I promise." Reluctantly, Rebecca agreed. Before leaving, she entered the small room where Garrett lay. His face was pale against the white pillowcase, his breathing still labored but more regular than before. Fresh bandages covered his shoulder, and someone had cleaned the blood and grime from his face and hands. Rebecca touched his forehead gently, finding it hot, but perhaps less searingly so than earlier. "Rest," she whispered. "You're safe now." As she turned to leave, her gaze fell on his coat draped over a nearby chair. The pocket watch would be there, she knew, along with the oilskin packet containing the page from the Confederate ledger. On impulse, she retrieved both items, tucking them securely in her own pocket. "I'll keep them safe," she promised the unconscious man. "Just like you asked." Outside, Sheriff Montgomery waited to escort her to the doctor's home. As they walked through the quiet streets now darkening with evening, Rebecca felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. Whether it was merely the natural curiosity of a small town regarding strangers or something more sinister, she couldn't be sure. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "if Vance is watching Stone Creek, he is." Montgomery interrupted with certainty. "Man like that always scouts his territory." "Then he knows we're here." Montgomery nodded, his expression grim in the fading light. "Most likely, but that might work to our advantage." "How?" Rebecca asked. The sheriff's smile held no warmth. "Because, for the first time in years, we know where to find him, too." Rebecca slept deeply that night, exhaustion finally claiming her despite her worries. Mrs. Henderson had provided a hot bath, clean clothes, and a simple but nourishing meal before showing her to a small guest room with a real bed, luxuries that seemed almost foreign after days in the wilderness. She woke to sunlight streaming through lace curtains and the smell of coffee and baking bread. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind. Where was the cold cabin, the sound of Garrett's labored breathing, the constant vigilance against danger? Reality returned quickly. Stone Creek, Dr. Henderson's home. Garrett in the medical office under the doctor's care. Garrett. She dressed hurriedly in the clothes Mrs. Henderson had provided, a simple dress that was slightly too large but clean and whole, and made her way downstairs. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Henderson greeted her warmly. "You look much better after some rest." "Breakfast," Rebecca accepted gratefully, though her thoughts were elsewhere. "How is Mr. Sullivan?" "My husband checked on him at dawn. The fever's still present, but hasn't worsened." Mrs. Henderson placed a cup of coffee before her. "He's a strong man." "Yes," Rebecca agreed softly. "He is." After a quick breakfast, she walked to the medical office where she found Dr. Henderson changing Garrett's bandages. To her relief, Garrett was awake, his eyes clear, though pain lined his face. "Miss Harlow," he acknowledged, his voice weak but steady. "You look better," she said, moving to his bedside. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Liar." Dr. Henderson finished securing the fresh bandage. He's improving, though he won't admit it. The infection hasn't spread, and his fever's lower this morning. Montgomery? Garrett asked, looking at Rebecca. I spoke with him yesterday. Told him about Vance. Garrett nodded slightly, wincing at the movement. The watch, the page. Rebecca patted her pocket. Safe. I've kept them with me. Relief crossed his features. Good. Dr. Henderson gathered his supplies. I'll leave you two to talk. Don't tire him out, Miss Harlow. He needs rest to heal. When they were alone, Garrett's expression grew serious. Vance knows we're here. Sheriff Montgomery thinks so too, Rebecca confirmed. Which means we don't have much time. Garrett attempted to sit up, grimacing with the effort. Rebecca placed a hand on his uninjured shoulder. You're not going anywhere. Not yet. He subsided, acknowledging the truth of her words with a frustrated sigh. Montgomery has a plan. He said something about using Vance's knowledge of our presence to our advantage. Garrett nodded, unsurprised. Tobias always was a strategist. Military mind. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sheriff Montgomery entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. His face broke into a genuine smile at the sight of Garrett awake. You look like hell, Sullivan, he greeted. Feel worse, Garrett replied dryly. Good to see you, Tobias. Montgomery pulled a chair beside the bed, his manner shifting to business. Miss Harlow told me about Vance. Hard to believe, but I've had reports that match up. Viper Gang's been operating in this territory for months. Stagecoach robberies, attacks on isolated homesteads, wagon trains. Not just robbery, Garrett said grimly. Trafficking, women, children. Montgomery's expression hardened. Figured as much. Some of the stage passengers who disappeared were never found. He leaned forward. We need to stop him, Garrett, permanently, this time. Agreed. But how? He's got numbers, knows the territory. So do we. Montgomery glanced at Rebecca, then back to Garrett. I've been thinking. Vance wants Miss Harlow, and he wants you dead. We can use that. Rebecca tensed. You want to use me as bait. Not exactly, Montgomery clarified, but we need to draw him in on our terms. The old church at the edge of town would be perfect, isolated enough to be believable, but close enough for my deputies to surround it. Garrett studied his old friend's face. You're suggesting we let him think he's springing a trap on us when really we're springing one on him, Montgomery finished. Exactly. Rebecca considered the plan. It was risky, certainly, but offered a chance to end the threat once and for all. I'll do it, she said firmly. Whatever's needed. Garrett looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. It's dangerous. I'm done running, she replied simply. Montgomery nodded, satisfied. We'll need a few days to prepare. Word needs to reach Vance through the right channels. We may not have days, Garrett warned. If he knows we're here, he won't move immediately, Montgomery interrupted. Not against a town with a sheriff and deputies. He'll watch, plan, wait for weakness. He stood, replacing his hat. Rest, regain your strength. I'll handle the arrangements. After the sheriff departed, Rebecca sat beside Garrett's bed, her expression thoughtful. He's right about Vance. The man is calculating, patient. Yes, Garrett agreed. It's what made him so effective during the war. He waits for the perfect moment to strike. Rebecca reached for his hand, surprising both of them with the gesture. We'll be ready when he does. Garrett's fingers closed around hers, warm and solid, despite his weakened state. For a long moment, they sat in silence, drawing strength from the simple human connection. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the window in a gentle curtain that muffled the sounds of the town beyond. The next 3 days passed in a rhythm of recovery and preparation. Garrett improved steadily under Dr. Henderson's care, the fever finally breaking on the second night. By the third day, he was able to sit up and even stand briefly, though the effort left him pale and shaking. Rebecca divided her time between Garrett's bedside and meetings with Sheriff Montgomery, who was methodically setting his trap. Word had been carefully spread that Garrett Sullivan lay near death, unable to be moved from the doctor's office. Rebecca was described as keeping vigil vulnerable and alone, except for the doctor's occasional presence. "If I know Vance," Montgomery explained during one planning session, "he'll move soon, probably tomorrow night when most of the town is at the social at the Masonic Hall." "How many men?" Rebecca asked. "My guess 4 or 5. He'll want enough to overpower any resistance, but not so many as to attract attention." Montgomery spread a crude map of the town across the table. "We'll position deputies here, here, and here. I'll be inside with you." "And me," Garrett insisted from his seat by the window. He had insisted on joining this final planning session despite Dr. Henderson's objections. Montgomery shook his head. "You can barely stand." "I can shoot," Garrett countered, "and Vance will expect me there even injured. If I'm missing, he'll suspect a trap." Rebecca saw the logic, though she shared Montgomery's concern about Garrett's condition. "He's right," she admitted reluctantly. "Vance knows Garrett wouldn't leave me unprotected." Montgomery sighed, conceding the point. "Fine, but you stay out of sight until necessary. No heroics." "Wouldn't dream of it," Garrett replied with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. As dusk approached the following day, Rebecca helped Garrett dress in fresh clothes provided by one of Montgomery's deputies. Though he tried to hide it, each movement clearly caused him pain, and sweat beaded on his forehead by the time he finished buttoning his shirt. "You don't have to do this," Rebecca said softly. "Montgomery and his men can handle Vance." Garrett looked at her, his expression resolute. "Yes, I do. This ends tonight, all of it. Vance, the war, the past." He reached for his gun belt, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. "I need to see it through." Rebecca understood. This confrontation had been brewing for 12 years, a reckoning postponed, but never forgotten. Garrett needed closure as much as he needed justice. She helped him secure the gun belt, then retrieved his coat. As he shrugged it on, she reached into her pocket and withdrew his silver pocket watch. "You might want this," she said, holding it out to him. Garrett hesitated, then took the timepiece, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. "Thank you. For keeping it safe. For giving me a reason to keep my promise," he replied quietly, tucking the watch into his vest pocket without opening it. The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks and turned away, busying herself with gathering her own things. Sheriff Montgomery arrived as darkness fell, accompanied by 2 deputies who would escort them to the old church. The building stood at the eastern edge of town, a simple wooden structure abandoned when the congregation built a larger church closer to the center of Stone Creek. Its location made it perfect for their purpose, isolated enough to seem a vulnerable target, yet close enough for the sheriff's men to surround it undetected. "Everything's in place," Montgomery reported. "Deputies positioned town distracted by the social." He handed Garrett a revolver. "Sure you're up to this?" Garrett checked the weapon with practiced ease despite his injury. "I'll manage." The small group made their way through the quiet streets, snow crunching beneath their boots. The moon was rising nearly full, casting a silver glow over the town and the surrounding wilderness. Perfect conditions for an ambush visibility for the defenders without compromising their concealed positions. The old church loomed ahead, its steeple a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. As they approached, Montgomery gestured for silence, then pointed to positions he wanted each person to take. The deputies would remain hidden outside until needed. Montgomery would position himself near the pulpit, where shadows would conceal his presence. Garrett would wait in the small anteroom adjacent to the main sanctuary. "And me?" Rebecca asked quietly. "Front pew," Montgomery instructed, "visible from the windows. Make it look like you're alone keeping vigil, while Sullivan supposedly recovers at the doctor's." Rebecca nodded, understanding her role in the deception. She was to be the lure, the vulnerable target that would draw Vance into their trap. They entered the church cautiously aware that Vance might have scouts watching the building. Inside, the air was cold and still smelling of dust and old hymnals. Moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Rebecca took her position in the front pew, removing her coat and arranging it beside her as if settled for a long wait. Montgomery melted into the shadows near the altar, while Garrett, moving stiffly but silently, positioned himself in the anteroom doorway, where he could observe without being easily seen. And then they waited, the minutes stretching into an hour, then two. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the old building settling and the distant hooting of an owl hunting in the nearby woods. Rebecca maintained her pose of solitary vigilance, though every nerve in her body was alert for danger. She found herself thinking of the path that had led her here, the orphanage, the laundry, the fateful encounter with Vance that had changed everything. And then Garrett, the unlikely sanctuary of his ranch, the journey through snow and danger to this moment of reckoning. A soft noise outside the church, the muffled sound of footsteps in snow, brought her instantly alert. She resisted the urge to turn to warn Garrett and Montgomery. Instead, she bowed her head slightly, as if lost in thought or prayer, while straining to hear the approach of their quarry. The church door opened with a faint creak. Cold air swept in, carrying with it the scent of pine and wood smoke. And something else, tobacco leather, the distinctive odor of gun oil. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her posture relaxed, her breathing even. "Miss Harlow," came a voice from the doorway, "how kind of you to wait for me." She turned then, feigning surprise. The man who stood in the entrance was tall and lean, his face half-shadowed by the brim of his hat. But there was no mistaking the scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, a pale furrow through his dark beard. Ezra Vance had arrived. Ezra Vance stepped into the church followed by 4 men who spread out behind him, hands resting on holstered weapons. All wore the bandanas of the Viper Gang around their necks, ready to be pulled up as masks, if needed. Vance himself carried no visible weapon, though Rebecca had no doubt he was armed. "I must say," Vance drawled, his voice cultured despite its southern inflection, "you've led us on quite a chase." Rebecca stood slowly, careful to appear nervous but not panicked. "What do you want?" Vance smiled at the expression never reaching his cold eyes. "I think you know, my dear. You took something that belongs to me. You caused me considerable inconvenience." He moved forward, his gait unhurried, confident. "And then there's the matter of poor Mary. Such a tragedy about that child." Rebecca's blood chilled. "What have you done to her?" "Me, nothing." Vance shrugged elegantly. "The wilderness, however, is not kind to little girls who wander alone in winter." Rage flared within Rebecca, momentarily overwhelming her fear. "You're lying! She got away." "Perhaps," Vance conceded, "though it hardly matters now." He glanced around the church, his gaze calculating. "Where is Sullivan still at the doctor's, clinging to thee?" A cruel smile played at his lips. "My men were instructed to make sure their shots were fatal. I'm disappointed they failed." Garrett Sullivan is none of your concern, Rebecca said, injecting as much conviction into her voice as she could muster. Vance laughed softly. On the contrary, he's been my concern for 12 years. He advanced another step. Did he tell you about our previous acquaintance, how he and his union friends stole something quite valuable from me? Rebecca maintained her composure, aware that Montgomery and Garrett were listening, waiting for the right moment. He mentioned it. Did he also mention that he killed my brother, shot him in the back during their escape? Vance's voice hardened. Thomas was 19, barely more than a boy. This was new information, something Garrett had never shared. Rebecca faltered momentarily, unsure how to respond. Vance noticed her hesitation and pressed his advantage. Sullivan has a talent for omitting inconvenient truths. I wonder what else he hasn't told you. He reached inside his coat, withdrawing a folded document. Such as the real reason I've been pursuing you. Rebecca tensed her gaze, fixed on the paper. What is that? A copy of a page from a certain ledger. Vance unfolded it carefully. A page listing Confederate agents operating behind Union lines, including one, James Harlow, your father. The revelation wasn't as shocking as Vance clearly expected it to be. Rebecca kept her expression neutral. I already know about that. Garrett showed me the page he kept. Surprise flickered across Vance's scarred face, quickly replaced by amusement. Did he now? How forthcoming of him. But did he tell you everything? He held up the document. Did he tell you that James Harlow wasn't just any agent, but a double agent working for the Union while pretending to work for the Confederacy? This was news, and Rebecca couldn't entirely hide her reaction. Vance smiled, seeing he'd struck a nerve. Oh yes, he continued. Your father was quite the patriot from the Northern perspective. Fed us false information for months, warned Union forces of our movements. His voice hardened, cost hundreds of Confederate lives with his treachery. Rebecca's mind raced, trying to process this new information while maintaining the charade. If that's true, why pursue me? I was a child when he died. Because, my dear Miss Harlow, your father took something from me before his untimely demise. Something of great value. Vance tucked the document away. I believe Sullivan has it now, a cipher key, the only copy remaining. Understanding dawned. The page from the ledger. Precisely. Not just names, but a key to decoding certain communications. Vance's expression grew calculating. Communications that might prove embarrassing to certain prominent individuals who survived the war with their reputations intact. Rebecca glanced toward the anteroom, knowing Garrett was listening. This explained why the page was so valuable, why Vance had pursued them so relentlessly. It wasn't just revenge, it was self-preservation. Now, Vance said, his tone becoming businesslike. Where is Sullivan hiding? And where is the cipher key? I don't know what you're talking about, Rebecca replied, stalling for time. Garrett is at the doctor's office, barely alive. The bullet your men put in him saw to that. Vance sighed theatrically. Miss Harlow, please don't insult my intelligence. Sullivan would never leave you unprotected, wounded, or not. He gestured to his men. Search the church. He's here somewhere. As the men spread out hands on their weapons, Rebecca tensed. The moment was approaching the confrontation they had planned for. She prayed Montgomery's deputies were ready outside. You won't find him, she said, raising her voice slightly, the signal they had agreed upon. Oh, I think we will, Vance replied confidently. And when we do, you'll what Ezra. The voice came from the anteroom doorway where Garrett now stood, revolver in hand. Finish what you started at Shiloh. Vance turned slowly, a smile spreading across his face. Sullivan, how fitting that you should join us. His eyes narrowed, assessing Garrett's condition. You look terrible, old friend. That wound troubling you. Not enough to stop me from putting a bullet in you, Garrett replied evenly. Vance's men had drawn their weapons at Garrett's appearance, but Vance himself seemed unconcerned. 5 against 1, Sullivan, and you can barely stand. Not favorable odds. Who said he was alone? Sheriff Montgomery emerged from the shadows near the altar, his revolver trained on Vance. Evening, Major. Been a long time. Vance's composure faltered momentarily at the sight of Montgomery. Lieutenant Montgomery. Or is it Sheriff? Now I see the war wasn't kind to you either. He nodded toward Montgomery's empty sleeve. Kind enough, Montgomery replied. I survived. More than many can say after encountering you. A tense silence filled the church as both sides assessed the situation. Vance's men were armed and ready, but so were Garrett and Montgomery. And outside, the sheriff's deputies waited for the signal to move in. Seems we have a standoff, Vance observed, his tone almost conversational. Not for long, Montgomery countered. My deputies have this place surrounded. Your men outside are already in custody. Doubt flickered in Vance's eyes, but he maintained his confident demeanor. An interesting claim, difficult to verify without someone making a very dangerous move. It's over, Vance, Garrett said firmly. The Viper Gang ends tonight. Vance's expression hardened. Nothing ends tonight except old grudges. His gaze shifted to Rebecca. Did Sullivan tell you how your father died, Miss Harlow? How he stood by and watched? Rebecca looked to Garrett, whose face had gone pale beneath his beard. What is he talking about? He's lying, Garrett said, but there was hesitation in his voice. Am I? Vance pressed. Tell her, Sullivan. Tell her how you and James Harlow were captured together, how you escaped while he was executed. That's not how it happened, Garrett insisted, though pain not physical, but something deeper crossed his features. Vance sensed weakness and continued his psychological assault. Your father died saving Sullivan's life, Miss Harlow. Sacrificed himself so this man could escape with the cipher key. His voice dripped with false sympathy. And Sullivan never told you, never even tried to find you afterward, though he knew you existed. Rebecca's world seemed to tilt on its axis. She looked to Garrett silently, pleading for denial, for explanation. Is it true? She asked quietly. Garrett met her gaze, anguish evident in his eyes. Not the way he tells it. He took a breath, steadying himself. Your father was captured with me. He helped me escape, yes, but I tried to get him out too. He refused, said someone had to stay behind to make the escape believable. How noble, Vance sneered. And yet you lived, he died, and his daughter ended up in an orphanage. Curious how that worked out in your favor. I didn't know about Rebecca until years later, Garrett countered. James showed me a photograph, once mentioned a daughter, but never said where she was. After the war, I tried to find her. Hired investigators followed every lead. The trail always went cold. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Rebecca wanted to believe him, needed to believe him. Then why didn't you tell me when you found out who I was? Because I wasn't certain, Garrett admitted. The name Harlow, your age, it fit, but I couldn't be sure until I confirmed it just now. Vance interrupted, a triumphant gleam in his eye. How delicious! The great Sullivan undone by his own secrets. While Vance was focused on the psychological warfare, Montgomery had been gradually shifting position, moving to where he could signal his deputies through the window. Rebecca noticed the movement, and understood they needed to keep Vance talking. "Why did you really come after me?" she asked Vance directly. "It wasn't just the cipher key." Vance turned his attention back to her, clearly enjoying being the center of the unfolding drama. "Perceptive, just like your father. No, it wasn't just the key, though, that would have been a valuable bonus." His expression darkened. "It was principle. James Harlow betrayed me, cost me everything. When I discovered his daughter was within my reach, well," he shrugged elegantly, "poetic justice demanded I complete the circle." "By trafficking me," Rebecca said coldly, "selling me like property." "By destroying you," Vance corrected, "as your father destroyed me. My reputation, my future, all gone because of his treachery." "That's what this has all been about?" Garrett asked incredulously. "Revenge on a dead man through his daughter." "Revenge is a powerful motivator, Sullivan. You, of all people, should understand that." Vance's smile was chilling. "And speaking of revenge," it happened in an instant. Vance reached into his coat and withdrew a small derringer. Before anyone could react, he aimed at Garrett and fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the confined space. Garrett staggered, but remained standing, his own weapon raised. For a moment, time seemed suspended, Vance's expression triumphant, Garrett's grimly determined. Then Rebecca screamed as crimson blossomed on Garrett's shirt, not at his injured shoulder, but at his chest, near his heart. Montgomery fired at the same moment, his bullet catching Vance in the arm. The small church erupted into chaos as the sheriff's deputies burst through doors and windows, weapons drawn. Vance's men fought briefly, but were quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers. Rebecca rushed to Garrett, who had collapsed to his knees, one hand pressed to his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers, bright against the white of his shirt. "Garrett," she sobbed, supporting him as he slumped against her. "Stay with me, please." His eyes found hers, pain, and something else, regret, perhaps evident in their depths. "The watch," he whispered. "Take it." Rebecca reached into his vest pocket with trembling fingers, retrieving the silver timepiece. It was warm from his body heat, the metal slick with blood. "Open it," Garrett urged, his voice weakening. "Time to keep my promise." With tears blurring her vision, Rebecca pressed the small catch that released the cover. The watch opened to reveal not only a clock face, but a small compartment in the lid. Within it was a miniature portrait, a beautiful woman with golden hair holding a small child on her lap. Eleanor and Emily. "Beautiful," Rebecca whispered, showing him the image. Garrett nodded faintly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Told them I'd find a reason." His eyes closed, then his body growing heavy against her. Rebecca held him tightly, unaware of the commotion around them as Montgomery's men subdued the last of Vance's gang. "Garrett," she called desperately. "Don't leave me, not now." But he gave no response, his breathing shallow and labored. The silver watch remained clutched in Rebecca's hand, its steady ticking a counterpoint to the erratic rhythm of Garrett's failing heart. 3 weeks passed in a blur of waiting and hoping. Winter settled fully upon Stone Creek, transforming the town into a postcard vision of snow-covered roofs and smoke curling from chimneys into the crisp blue sky. Inside Dr. Henderson's medical office, Rebecca kept a near-constant vigil at Garrett's bedside. The second bullet had missed his heart by less than an inch, but had collapsed his lung and lodged dangerously close to his spine. Dr. Henderson had operated immediately, working through the night to extract the bullet and repair the damage. Even then, he had offered little hope for recovery. "If he survives the next 3 days," the doctor had told Rebecca gently, "we can begin to hope." Garrett had survived those critical days, and then a week, and then two. His recovery was agonizingly slow periods of consciousness interspersed with fever and delirium. During the worst times, Rebecca read to him from Eleanor's Bible, her voice steady, even when her heart was not. Sheriff Montgomery visited daily, bringing news of the outside world. Vance had survived his wound and now occupied a cell in the jailhouse, awaiting transfer to the territorial prison. His men had been similarly incarcerated, or in 2 cases buried in the town cemetery after choosing to fight rather than surrender. The Viper Gang was finished. Its reign of terror ended that night in the old church. Reports from surrounding settlements confirmed that stagecoaches now traveled unmolested, and homesteaders slept more soundly without the threat of midnight raids. "You should be proud," Montgomery told Rebecca one afternoon as they shared coffee in the small waiting room outside Garrett's chamber. "You helped bring down one of the worst criminal outfits in the territory." Rebecca shook her head. "I just survived. It was you and Garrett who ended it." Montgomery studied her over the rim of his cup. "You did more than survive, Miss Harlow. You showed remarkable courage throughout." He paused, setting his coffee aside, "which is why I wanted to speak with you about a certain matter." Rebecca tensed, uncertain what was coming. "Oh, I've been in contact with the territorial governor regarding Vance's case. Given the unusual circumstances, he's taken a personal interest." Montgomery reached into his coat and withdrew an official-looking document. "This arrived yesterday." Rebecca accepted the paper hesitantly. It was a letter addressed to her bearing the governor's seal. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it and read the formal text. "I don't understand," she said after a moment. "What does this mean?" "It means, Miss Harlow, that your father has been officially recognized as a Union operative who gave his life in service to his country." Montgomery's expression was solemn but kind. "His name will be added to the roll of honor in the Capitol, and there's a small pension retroactive. It's all yours." Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes. After all these years, her father's sacrifice was being acknowledged. The shame and uncertainty that had shadowed her memories of him lifted, replaced by a quiet pride. "Thank you," she whispered. Montgomery nodded, understanding the depth of emotion behind those simple words. "There's more," he said. "The governor mentioned that the school in Pine Ridge is still without a teacher. Given your interest in education, he thought you might consider the position." Rebecca's heart skipped. A teaching position, the very thing she had been traveling to Oregon to find when fate intervened. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," Montgomery suggested. "Pine Ridge is only 20 miles from here, close enough to visit regularly." His gaze shifted meaningfully toward Garrett's room. Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Sheriff Montgomery, Tobias," he corrected gently. "And don't worry, I'm not presuming anything. Just observing that Stone Creek might benefit from having you nearby." Before Rebecca could respond, Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her expression bright. "He's awake," she announced, "and asking for you, Miss Harlow." Rebecca rose immediately, tucking the governor's letter into her pocket. "Excuse me, Sheriff Tobias. I should go to him." Montgomery stood as well, reaching for his hat. "Of course. Tell Sullivan I'll stop by tomorrow. We have some unfinished business to discuss." Rebecca hurried to Garrett's room, her heart racing with hope and trepidation. Each time he woke was precious, but this awakening seemed different. Mrs. Henderson's excitement suggested something had changed. She found Garrett propped against pillows, his face pale and drawn from weeks of illness, but his eyes clear and alert. The bandages around his chest were visible beneath his nightshirt, a reminder of how close death had come. "Rebecca," he greeted her, his voice weak but steady. "You're awake," she said unnecessarily, moving to his bedside. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been shot. Twice." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "But alive. Definitely alive." Rebecca sat in the chair beside the bed, studying his face for signs of the improvement Mrs. Henderson had implied. "The doctor says you're healing. Slowly, but healing." Garrett nodded slightly. "Henderson told me I have you to thank for that. Said you've barely left my side." Heat crept up Rebecca's neck. "I wanted to be here when you woke up." Every time, she confirmed softly. A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with unspoken emotions too complex for simple articulation. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, large flakes drifting lazily past the glass. "The watch," Garrett said finally. "You opened it." Rebecca reached into her pocket where she had carried the silver timepiece since that night at the church. "Yes, you asked me to." She placed it in his palm and his fingers closed around it with surprising strength. "I made a promise," he murmured, "to Eleanor, to Emily, that I wouldn't open it until I found a reason to move forward." "And did you?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Find a reason." Garrett's gaze met hers, direct and unguarded. "Yes." The simple affirmation hung in the air between them, its implications both thrilling and terrifying. Rebecca looked down, unsure how to respond. "Sheriff Montgomery came today," she said, changing the subject. "Vance is being transferred to the territorial prison next week." Garrett nodded, accepting the shift in conversation. "Good. He'll hang this time. No convenient fires to fake his death." "The governor sent a letter," Rebecca continued, touching her pocket where the document rested. "About my father. They're recognizing his service officially, adding his name to the roll of honor." Pride and sadness mingled in Garrett's expression. "James would have appreciated that. He was a good man, Rebecca, the best I knew during those dark times." Vance said. She hesitated, uncertain whether to broach the painful subject. "He said you were there when my father died." Garrett closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength for a difficult confession. "Yes, we were captured together during a mission behind Confederate lines. Your father had been feeding us information for months. Troop movements, supply lines, command changes." He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze directly. "Vance discovered him. We tried to escape together, but your father was wounded. He knew he couldn't make it." Pain crossed Garrett's features at the memory. "He gave me the cipher key, made me promise to get it to Union intelligence. Said it was more important than his life." Rebecca listened silently, tears gathering in her eyes. "I didn't want to leave him," Garrett continued, his voice rough with emotion. "But he insisted. Said someone had to stay behind, make them think the key was still there, while I got away with the real one." He swallowed hard. "Last thing he said to me was to find his daughter if I survived the war. Tell her he died for something he believed in." A tear slipped down Rebecca's cheek. "But you couldn't find me." "I tried," Garrett said simply. "For 2 years after the war, I searched. Your mother had died, the orphanage records were incomplete. The trail went cold in Pennsylvania. And then I showed up in your shed," Rebecca said, a hint of wonder in her voice. "After all those years, when I saw that star-shaped scar, I thought it was Vance's mark. Thought maybe you were working for him." Garrett's expression softened. "Then I began to notice little things, the way you held yourself, your eyes. So like James." "Why didn't you tell me when you suspected?" Garrett sighed. "Wasn't certain. Didn't want to give you false hope. And then there was Vance the danger." He shook his head slightly. I should have told you. I'm sorry. Rebecca reached for his hand, her fingers closing around his. You kept your promise to my father. You protected me just as he asked. Not well enough, Garrett replied grimly. You suffered at that orphanage with Vance. If I'd found you sooner— Don't, Rebecca interrupted. We can't change the past, only decide what to do with the future we have. Garrett studied her face as if committing every feature to memory. And what future is that, Rebecca Harlow? She told him then about the governor's offer, the teaching position in Pine Ridge, the proximity to Stone Creek. As she spoke, hope kindled in Garrett's eyes, replacing the shadows of regret that had lingered there. 20 miles isn't far, he observed when she finished. Good road between here and there, even in winter. No, Rebecca agreed, a smile touching her lips. Not far at all. Garrett shifted slightly, wincing at the pain the movement caused. I should tell you, while we're speaking of futures, Montgomery wrote to me last week, offered me a position as deputy once I'm recovered. Surprise and pleasure mingled in Rebecca's expression. Here, in Stone Creek. Here, Garrett confirmed, said a man with my experience would be valuable. That the territory is changing needs law enforcement that understands both the old ways and the new. Are you going to accept? Garrett glanced toward the window where snow continued to fall, transforming the world outside into a clean, unmarked expanse of white. Told him I needed to think about it. Wasn't sure if I should stay. And now? Rebecca asked, her heart beating faster. Garrett's gaze returned to her, warm and certain. Now I think Stone Creek might be exactly where I belong. The implications of their conversation, the teaching position, the deputy's badge, the proximity these roles would create, hung between them, full of possibility. Neither was ready to name the connection that had formed during their journey, but both recognized its existence, its potential. Spring isn't far off, Garrett said after a moment. Few more months of winter, then the passes will clear. The school term would start after planting, Rebecca added. Early May, most likely. That gives me time to heal, to rebuild strength. Garrett's hand tightened around hers. To make plans. Rebecca nodded, understanding the careful path they were charting together. Not rushing, not presuming, but acknowledging the future that might await if they chose to walk toward it side by side. Outside, the afternoon light began to fade, casting the room in soft shadows. Rebecca rose to light the lamp, but Garrett caught her hand, keeping her close. The night you found me in the shed, he said quietly. I thought my life had ended years ago when I buried Eleanor and Emily. Thought I was just going through the motions, waiting to join them. Rebecca remained still, sensing the importance of his words. I was wrong, Garrett continued. Life doesn't end with loss. It changes, becomes something different, something new. His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. I'm grateful, Rebecca Harlow, that you showed me that. And I'm grateful you were there to open that sack, she replied, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. Garrett smiled, then a genuine smile that transformed his weathered face and reached his eyes, chasing away the last shadows of grief that had dwelled there. Seems we saved each other. Rebecca returned the smile, her heart full. Seems we did. 3 months later, as the first green shoots pushed through the melting snow and the Wyoming hills, awakened from their winter slumber, 2 figures stood before a small, weathered grave marker on a quiet hillside outside Stone Creek. Garrett Sullivan, now recovered enough to walk with only a slight limp, and Rebecca Harlow, soon to begin her teaching position in Pine Ridge, placed fresh wildflowers before the simple stone that marked the resting place of Eleanor and Emily Sullivan. They would have liked you, Garrett said softly. Eleanor especially. She believed in second chances. Rebecca slipped her hand into his. "Is that what we are? Second chances?" Garrett considered this, his gaze moving from the grave to the woman beside him, then to the silver pocket watch he held in his free hand. The timepiece was open now, the portraits of Eleanor and Emily visible within a testament to lives cherished and remembered. "Not second chances," he finally said. "New beginnings, different but no less valuable for being unexpected." Rebecca nodded, understanding the distinction. They weren't replacing what had been lost, but building something new from the foundations of their shared experiences, both painful and healing. As they turned to leave, walking slowly back toward town, where Sheriff Montgomery waited to officially swear in his new deputy, Garrett paused to look back once more at the grave. "Kept my promise, Eleanor," he whispered. "Found my reason." Rebecca squeezed his hand, and together they continued down the path, leaving footprints in the soft spring earth, not erasing the past, but moving forward into a future neither could have imagined when their paths first crossed on a stormy night beneath the vast Wyoming sky. Behind them, wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze, and ahead, the town of Stone Creek awaited its buildings, catching the morning light like a promise of home.